name is Sakira Cook. I'm with the Leadership Conference Education Fund, and we've been working in partnership with the U.S. Human Rights Network, the European Network of People of African Descent, and the Thurgood Marshall Center at Howard University Law School to put together this mid-decade summit, which is really an opportunity for advocates and activists from around the world to come together and be in conversation about looking at what the decade has accomplished in the last 5 years, what we need to accomplish in the next 5 years, and then how do we work together in an international coalition to accomplish those shared goals. So today is a really exciting day of discussion and opportunity for connection, and we really appreciate all of you who are tuning in online and those of you who are here in person. So I'm going to introduce my colleague Salima Hankins, who's going to moderate our first discussion and also just give us a brief overview of the day. Thank you. Also, one thing to note, this is going to be translated in Spanish and English, Portuguese, for folks who are native Spanish speakers or native Portuguese speakers. And so to listen in English, it's 1 on your trans headset. I think Spanish is 2, and Spanish is 2, and Portuguese is 3. So just again, English 1, Spanish 2, Portuguese 3. Thank you so much.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sakira. My name is Salima Hankins. I am the Deputy Director of the U.S. Human Rights Network. Our organization has been doing a lot of work around the International Decade for People of African Descent within the United States, and then we've also been in connection with our partners, people of African descent globally, to put this event together. I want to give you a little bit of a brief overview of the day. As Sakira mentioned, our goals is really for this event is both for education and then also as a strategy session. Now that we have all of these folks together who have different experiences from around the world as people of African descent, sort of engaging in the decade, but also dealing with various challenges that they have within their countries. So in the beginning, we're going to start off with a review of the progress made and the challenges in the first half of the International Decade. So the International Decade for People of African Descent was designated and is from 2015 to 2024. So we're right at the halfway mark. So what we want to do is just kind of have the first panel do a look back at some of the things that we've accomplished and then also some of the challenges. And then the second panel will actually be a moderated town hall to really think about the vision for the decade and how we actually move forward. And then we'll break for lunch. After lunch, we'll have a panel on reparatory justice. There's been a lot of discussion around reparations around the world, and we have some experts here to give really some insight into what reparatory justice would look like. And then we actually are going to break off into working sessions where we will discuss the UN Permanent Forum, the UN Declaration for People of African Descent, and various national plans of action. And then we'll have closing remarks. And in addition to that, I want to make folks aware, the folks in this room, aware that Momentum Education provides a personal and leadership development, and they have agreed to give everyone here a $500 scholarship if you're interested in signing up for their program as well. So with that, we'll get started because I will be moderating our first panel. So I'm going to ask the panelists to come up, and then I will then introduce them. So, yeah. Thank you. Modi might be missing. As we're waiting for the panelists to come up, I want to remind folks that we are live streaming in 3 languages. You can go to idpad.org/summit to get the links for the various languages, and that people are welcome to ask questions in those languages, and we'll have someone who can read those questions out. So you can type in your questions during the chat, and then I will read those questions out. Also, people in the audience, we encourage you to ask questions of the panelists as well. We're going to have them present first, and then we'll take questions. and I will do a brief introduction of each of the panelists, just saying their names and their organizations. So first we have Mireille Fanon-Mendez Franz, who is with the Franz Fanon Foundation and also a former expert with the working group of experts on people of African descent with the UN. And then we have Kristen Baez, who is with an organization called Lumbanga, which is an Afro-Chilean organization. Then we have Melissa Barswick, who is the chair of the IDPAD Summit in Guyana. We have Wade Henderson, who is a former director of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And then we have Modi Tambwe, who is with the International Network of People of African Descent. So I think we're going to start with Mireille, if you want to.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the organizer and the Howard University hosting us. The organizers asked me, as a former expert of the working group, to make an overview of the decade since its beginning. I have to say, unfortunately, and I will be brief on these 5 first years, nothing was achieved. And to try to make a report on this first 5 years is waste of time. And I think we have something else to do than to lose our time. But we can try to understand why nothing was done. And if nothing was done, it's for sure the responsibility of the international community as a state representative, because since the beginning, the process of the decade, of the International Decade for People of African Descent, under the Durban mechanism, was systematically criticized and even not approved by certain states, even if they vote for, but they don't approve really it. That's why we are in this kind of nightmare for people of African descent. Because what is the result of that? The structural, systemic racism is still present. And the number of people of African descent killed here in US, but in Brazil, and now in Europe, face this new fascist approach is increasing. The number of people of African descent incarcerated is increasing all around the world. That's why we have to criticize this empty box for the international decade. But also it is our responsibility. What really have we done for the success of the international decade? And I can say, traveling everywhere, meeting people, speak with the people, making some action with the people, and through also the Franz Fanon Foundation, we don't have achieved what we have to do. And for one reason, because until now, our force is really limited. Because we don't build a counter force against this white supremacy and against this neoliberalism and against this modernity, this so-called Eurocentric modernity. And what we have to build now, from now, it's this coalition, whatever the name, coalition, movement, whatever, but a real force used as a counterpower against the white supremacists. And we have to do that because there is an urgency for the people of African descent, but also for the indigenous people. And I am just back from Brazil. What I discovered the situation of indigenous people. I can say without any mistake, their situation is worse than ours as a people of African descent. And really, we have to do something, and even we have to unite our force with indigenous people. Because we are on the same page. We fight for freedom, for emancipation, for liberation, for sovereignty, for the right to sovereignty, for the right to development. And the right to development is not to adopt the liberal system, is not to be, to be associated or integrated in the liberal system. It's to change the capitalist system that put us in enslavement, because we have to not forget capitalism is born on the basis of enslavement and transatlantic trade slave. And it is something it's always forget. We have to, every time, to go back to our history and to not accept what they want. I don't want to live as we are living right now on a neoliberal system where the people are exploited, marginalized, and when they are African descent, they are more exploited and marginalized than the other. It is exactly the same way that it was done before. It is exactly the same process. We have to break the process, and it is only through this interrogation of capitalism we will solve the problem of systemic and structural racism. There is one way to do that. One way, and I think there is only one way. We have to agree, all of us, African descent, indigenous also, but African descent all around the world, and not be divided as African descent, because the situation is specific in US and specific in Europe. No. All the people of African descent and Africans all around the world face the same process, systemic and structural racism. And the only way to tackle this is to work on a reparation. On reparation as international movement to get reparation all around the world. Because this former colonizer state are still colonizer, neo-colonial state. They are still there, and they are doing exactly the same thing with African continent if we know exactly what's happened in Africa. It is exactly the same thing. And we have to denounce that and to work on the reparation process and to build an international reparation, because all around the world we are working, for example, in Guadeloupe against France, but it's not easy. They are working in CARICOM. There is a 10-action plan of CARICOM. We have to support it. We have to support all the initiatives taken directly against state, for the former colonizer state and slaver state. We have to do that. And it is through this process of reparation we could achieve, and not the contrary, we could achieve the declaration for people of human rights for people of African descent. And also, through this reparation process, we could also achieve the issue of the permanent forum. And the permanent forum is for us like a means to get the issue of reparation on the table. And we don't have to resign that. We have to assume and to be very strong with that. And not to accept what the UN wants. Because the UN is not, we have to understand that. Since 1974, when Kofi Annan was a Secretary General, and when he issued a report, a terrible report, saying how we can work with the public-private sector, you remember this? It was a terrible report. And it gives us exactly where they want to go. And we don't have to accept that. We want to see the structural racism that kill everybody, everywhere, all around the world, achieve and end. And it is under our responsibility. It will be possible only if we unite all around the world and if we accept to build some movement around reparation and around against systemic and structural racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mireille. And now we have Kristen. And if you want, you can just use the microphone there.
¿Aló? ¿Se escucha? Sí. Bueno, buenos días a todas y a todos. Agradecer la invitación de Human Rights por estar acá. Bueno, algunos ya saben, vengo desde Chile, desde un país que hoy día está sufriendo tremendamente una crisis sobre cómo ha sido esta construcción de este Chile de hace 30 años. Una construcción que de alguna forma excluye no solamente a nivel de clase, sino también excluye a nivel de raza. Y tanto los pueblos indígenas como los afrodescendientes son parte también de esta crisis y esta explosión que hoy día estamos demostrando que el clasismo, el racismo y la vulneración de derechos en mi país es algo que hoy día debe terminar. Y si bien soy director de la ONG de afrodescendientes chilenos Lumbanga, también vengo en representación, miembro parte del grupo impulsor del ALDA, que es una ALDA alternativa latinoamericana para el diseño afrodescendiente, que somos un grupo de líderes y lideresas afrodescendientes de las Américas y de otras partes del mundo para impulsar la agenda del diseño. Y eso es importante mencionarlo porque estamos trabajando en varias acciones, no solamente en el foro, sino en otras acciones. Mi reflexión tiene que ver con la ley de aprobación de este año. El 16 de abril del 2019 se aprobó la ley de reconocimiento del pueblo tribal afrodescendiente. O sea, cuando hablamos de pueblo tribal afrodescendiente, tiene relación un concepto que vincula no solamente a lo que es la Declaración y Plan de Acción de Durban, sino es una vinculación también hacia un convenio internacional, que es el convenio 169 de la OIT, de pueblos indígenas y tribales, que como decía mi amigo John Antón, que el concepto tribal es una definición colonial y que hoy día esta ley de reconocimiento de este pueblo tribal afrodescendiente viene a abrir a un desafío sobre redefinir el concepto de la tribalidad. Y en ese desafío, nosotros hace 10 años hemos hecho 3 intentos de ingresar proyectos de ley de reconocimiento de nuestro pueblo afrodescendiente, afrochileno, y en los 2 intentos fueron fallidos. Pero en el año 2015, cuando hacemos el lanzamiento del diseño en Santiago de Chile, en Naciones Unidas, presentamos una nueva forma de generar estrategias de inclusión, siempre en el marco del diseño. Y en esa estrategia hicimos dos acciones claras. Reconocernos a través de las estadísticas, que era incluir en los censos nacionales, y reconocernos a través de sistema jurídico, que es a través de una ley. El primer intento de incluir, de reconocernos a través de las estadísticas, a través del censo, de los censos, fue fallido porque de alguna forma, si bien el discurso, el fundamento estaba vinculado al Plan de Acción de Durban, pero también el Plan de Acción del diseño no vincula, no incluye el tema de la inclusión en los censos, en las estadísticas, no especifica fuertemente, y ahí fue algo fallido, donde en el censo abreviado del 2017 nos excluyen definitivamente y nos fundamentan puros argumentos técnicos racistas que dicen que no se podía porque técnicamente era imposible incluir la pregunta variable afrodescendiente. Eso se hizo una denuncia a la CIDH, a la Comisión Interamericana sobre esta exclusión. Hoy día se está investigando el tema, pero paralelamente nos dimos cuenta que teníamos una ventaja de que en la década del decenio era necesario fundamentar a través de una ley, de un proyecto de ley, sobre la importancia de reconocerlos. Y ahí fue así que este proyecto de ley fue diseñado desde la sociedad civil. O sea, este proyecto tiene una riqueza en su forma, en cómo se llevó, porque no siempre en Chile y a lo mejor en muchos países estos proyectos que nacen de la sociedad civil se aprueban tan rápidamente, ¿ya? Y fue la experiencia y la estrategia del movimiento afrochileno de poder presionar y generar los insumos para que el congresista, autor de la ley que llevó este proyecto al Congreso, pudiese aprobarse sin problemas. Si bien el proyecto de ley se presentaron 18 artículos, se terminó en 7, pero es un proyecto que de alguna forma, en términos estructurales, marca un futuro importante a lo que se viene en el concepto de lo que queremos de reparaciones históricas, porque la ley dice no obliga a tener reparaciones, pero si tú vinculas esta ley de reconocimiento con un convenio internacional, como es el convenio 169 de la OIT, que está ratificado por el Estado de Chile, de alguna forma va vinculando fuertemente sobre el racismo estructural que hemos tenido nuestros antepasados que llegaron como esclavos a este territorio chileno. Entonces, hoy día estamos en un proceso interesante de diseñar el reglamento de la ley. Este proceso de discusión, de lucha que se hizo, duró 2 años y medio. O sea, el año 2016 ingresa el proyecto de ley y el 2019 se aprueba. Y eso tiene un valor tremendo. O sea, estos proyectos que vienen de la sociedad civil en Chile por lo general duran 10 años. Se demoran 10 años en aprobarse. Y lo que hicimos nosotros fue una estrategia muy interesante que ha sido visto desde la comunidad internacional, desde la academia de organismos internacionales y académicos, como algo, como un modelo interesante de seguir. Si bien tiene 7 artículos, pero es una ley que define lo interesante es la construcción de pueblos. Y creo que ahí quiero enfatizar fuertemente. Nuestros ancestros y ancestras venían de pueblos, ¿cierto? Creo que parece que en inglés la palabra pueblo es difícil de definir, ¿cierto? El concepto pueblo, ¿cierto?, tiene un concepto de cómo vivían, en la cosmovisión, de la forma de estructura que vivían nuestros ancestras y ancestros en África. Y esa forma de vivir la trajeron a América. La resistencia que hicieron nuestros antepasados fue vivir en comunidad desde una forma como pueblo. Y cuando vemos en Colombia, en los territorios ancestrales, cuando vemos en Bolivia, en los Yungas, en Ecuador, en Esmeralda, en estas zonas ancestrales rurales, cómo mantienen una estructura de códigos ancestrales que nos definen la categoría pueblo. Entonces, en Chile, definir la categoría pueblo era importante no solamente para nosotros como afrochilenos, sino que es necesario para la comunidad internacional empezar a construir y a demostrarle al Estado y a los organismos internacionales como Naciones Unidas que es necesario tener una ley, un reconocimiento como pueblo a nivel universal y no necesariamente como personas y como comunidades. Entonces, hoy día el desafío del pueblo afrochileno tiene que ver cómo hoy día vamos a avanzar en el marco del decenio con con los otros 2 puntos, que es la justicia y el desarrollo. Y en esa justicia y el desarrollo está claramente vincular lo que es no solamente el decenio, sino que este foro permanente que hoy día se está a punto de aprobar, porque se necesita definir que el desarrollo, la justicia y el desarrollo tiene que ir de la mano con políticas claras, no solamente a nivel nacional, sino a nivel internacional. Para terminar, creo que una de las reflexiones que hoy día conversamos con una compañera, de que los afrochilenos, los afrodescendientes de las Américas, estamos divididos en un espacio de idioma. O sea, ha sido difícil desde la conferencia de Santiago hasta ahora tener un diálogo entre el norte de América con la parte de América Latina y el Caribe. Hoy día lo que se está haciendo hoy día se celebra y es muy importante porque hay un desafío de definir que el barco que trajeron nuestros antepasados se distribuyó en todas las Américas. Entonces, diferenciarnos que los afroamericanos y los afro-latinoamericanos son distintos es un error tremendo. Hoy día en lo que viene de la década, en el término medio, lo que queda del decenio afrodescendiente, es necesario poder seguir articulando tanto los afroestadounidenses del norte de América con el resto de la diáspora africana, no solamente de América Latina y el Caribe, y también de África y Europa. Eso, muchas gracias.
Okay, good morning. And thank you very much for inviting me to update you on what GAN is doing as it relates to the International Decade for People of African Descent. The journey for the decade began in 2016 for Guyana. When in early 2016, if you went online and you Googled International Decade for People of African Descent, the only information that you would have seen is about the launching, and that is post 1 year into the decade. So with the fear of what happened when there was the international year, I think it was 2011, where nothing was achieved, a group of us in Guyana got together and we said, okay, let's start at least one activity for the decade. And that was Guyana's Jubilee celebration. And so we, under the decade, we recognized 50 African Guyanese men and 50 African Guyanese female who have made significant contribution to Guyana over that 50 years. Then again, at the end of 2016, if you Google International Decade, there was again the launching of the decade. There was information on the activity that we had there in Guyana, the awards. And I just found out this morning that the other activity that was out of St. Lucia was hosted by our brother who's here from St. Lucia, Chevy, who's also a fellow for the UN Decade. So at that point, we decided that we need to bring like minds together under the theme where we are, where we ought to be, and how do we get there by 2024 and beyond. So we gather a few experts in the fields of education and culture and education, health, ICT, human rights human rights and geopolitics, and also business and finance. And so at the end of the summit in 2018, what we produced was a working document. And we created 5 different institutes under those same 5 areas that we focused on during the summit. So what has been achieved so far? I'm happy to say at least there are 4 areas that we have been working on and we have been seeing some achievement. And one of those basic areas is to bridge the communication gap between the diaspora and Africa, to help in increasing trade between the regions, to help in terms of transport to and from, having easy access. And so there are 2 areas that we were working on is to make Guyana the transit hub for Africa, for the region, the Caribbean region, 1. And 2, we were also lobbying for visa-free, or let's say visa waivering for people of African descent who would like to return to Africa. So far, we have presented the proposal to the African Union during their visit to Guyana in 2018. And during the recent visit by the Ghanaian president to Guyana, the Foreign Affairs Office asked us what we want to be on the agenda. And again, we presented those 2 broad areas that came out of the summit. We are happy to announce that Guyana and Ghana currently have visa waiver. I think our sister island, Jamaica, also do not have to have a visa to go to and from Ghana, and vice versa. And so that is one of the achievements. But however, we would love to call for an international recognition for all African descendants to have visa waiver as it relates to going to the continent. And the African Union, I must acknowledge, is working on an African Union passport. And that is something I think that we in the wider diaspora society should be advocating for also, especially since we want to have the linking of cultures from the diaspora and Africa also. And the Ghanaian government, I know I might be mixing you up with Guyana and Ghana, But the Ghanaian government also indicated to us, since we in Guyana have bilateral agreements with Ghana, that they're working on having an airline that is going to be traveling from Guyana to Ghana. So let me give you an example. I was in Senegal about 2 weeks ago, and to get to Senegal from Guyana, I had to go to Miami, New York, Casablanca, and then to Senegal. It was about 20 hours. But in reality, the U.S. Army fuel up in Guyana and go straight across the Atlantic in 6 hours to Senegal. 6 hours. To Ghana is just about 7 hours. But yet there is no commercial route for us who would like to return to Africa and those from Africa who would like to come to the region. So besides those two areas, we have also been lobbying for, and that was since 1998, for October 12th to be the International Day of Recognition for the African Maafa, the African Holocaust. I know here in the United States it's considered Columbus Day, and also now it's Indigenous People Day. And as our sister just mentioned, is that we have to work with our indigenous brothers and sisters, because overall we all feel the same pain. Our ancestors felt the pain of Columbus discovering this new world. And it is about time that we recognize our ancestors for what they have gone through during that period. And so we would like to call for action for the international civil society to also lobby for October 12th to be in that international year for National Day for the recognition of the African Holocaust. So those are some of the things that we have been working on, and I think we consider as achievements. So far, there are quite a lot of challenges, but this afternoon, I think I will be also discussing that with Isabel's group, that she will be facilitating, and what are some of the challenges that we have been faced with. And of course, we don't have a black economy, so that you can imagine what that main challenge is. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, Modi, you can go ahead.
I can be next. Okay. Thank you. I'm not going to thank again the organizer, but to save time and be able to share with you. I'm going to speak from NPAD perspective, European Network of African Descent, and I'll go through it in 3 roads, I would say. First, I'll just respond to what it has been as a regional grassroots in organizing and the importance of a network. Why is it so important? Then that will be around what are the main challenges that we face. That can be also something that we can cover, and see a little bit an overview of some countries in the development in the framework of the decade. And to start with why it's important to have a network, that's a way of talking of what is European Network of People of African Descent in Europe. It's a network that started as networking meetings. It started with people coming together for almost 14 different countries, European different countries, with all kinds of experiences, competencies, and activities, as well coming from a scientific, academic, law background, as well as artists and culture, as well as grassroots organizer for specific communities, among us women, youth, nurses, and teachers also. And that's a very important element that we started first as convening as with our dynamics, the dynamics we were in in our own countries. It started with meetings because there was, after one meeting that was organized at EU level, what struck everybody is that we all face the same structural discrimination and challenges in our countries. Only the expression are different, but it's bottom line is the same structural discrimination that we have all inherited in our countries, and therefore we created this space to discuss that, coming from our own country experiences, and see how this convey us all at AU level. And one discussion, one meeting leading to the other. I think it was after the fourth networking meeting that we said, but we have to mold that into a formal organization that will lead those meetings and those network possibilities that we could have. And hence, this is how the European network is born. From my perspective, at Countryside, I am coming from Belgium, and this was a constellation of organizations. The one that I represent within the network is the Conseil des Communautés Africaines en Europe, which is a French-speaking, and that's where also for us it was also important to be inclusive in bringing everybody in an intersectional or an holistic way around the table, even in the language we use, because not being financed enough to have translation, we need to make sure that people are not excluded because they're not using one of the main dominant language, because it's also a way of excluding some communities that cannot come because they might not be as proficient in one or other language, or we can't provide translation of all the big colonial languages that we all use in the end. That's one of the interrogation. And the context of the decade was really important because that was a common context, even if it translates in very different activities. We had a common context to convey and to work together, and that's how it appeared clear to us that one of the mission of ENPAD would be really to promote that context, to promote that framework within the member organization and abroad, even at AU level. If it is as it is today, to advocate and lobby, it is within that framework of human rights, because that was also something specific, because we are speaking from our own context and in our own shoes. I mean, we are the voice of ourselves. It's not somebody else voicing us in that framework or voicing for us. That's for the part on how important networking has been for us, how important the framework of the decade is important for us at AU level, and now how also we can influence. That's where now I can talk about the country's experience with the decade, its launch and the implementation of the program of activities and action plan at national level, because there we gain knowledge of the decade, what it is, the program, the plan, and all the procedures that have been thought of in the resolution, and we could go back as different country members in our country and see, because we had now the grasp who are the institutions responsible to implement, who should be sitting around the table in framing a plan, who should be around the table, even if it's the launch. And to cut the long story short, today within the 28 European countries, it's only 2 countries that have institutionally launch the decade, and this is very important. It's only two countries, Belgium and the Netherlands. We will talk later on the detail on this and what it means exactly, because it's not because there's a launch that there's automatically a plan, and it's not. That doesn't mean that PAD people, communities are always included in the framing of the program and the launch. We'll talk about that because I have only 30 seconds. At EU level, though, we have to know that there's no formal institution recognition by the EU of the decade and its program, which makes more difficult to have countries recognizing institutionally in there, and where they do, it's due to the pressure of the communities, thanks to the work done within the networks and the promotion on it. Nevertheless, this year, Europe launched its resolution on fundamental rights of people of African descent. But there's no plan, there's no budget. That's another story that we can have in the practical. And today, what do we see as challenges that we encountered as organizations and communities? It's about the knowledge, because even if there's a group now that know, it's important that it doesn't become an elitist knowledge.
Yeah.
It has to be a mass education, because it's about people knowing their right in the end of the story, knowing their right and being able to navigate toward institution when it comes to have recognition and reparation if needed. It's also knowing challenge of legitimacy, making sure that whoever it is, we are legitimately representing and speaking on behalf. It's also something that we have to objectively be aware of, the legitimacy question, and funding. Not always funding in the sense of funding for the advocacy or other, but really funds for organization actively working to restore on the ground and on the floor. And this is very tricky, because we'll speak about that when we talk about the challenges of the launch and the funding, because you might end up competing with mainstream human rights defending organizations that are very supported structurally, and because of that, they're in front line of the budget line that is open and accessible for our organization, and then you most of the time lose the competition. They gain the work while you've been lobbying for the fund. That's one. At institution level, it's also re-education of those institutions, of them to be aware that the third party in the discussion when it comes to human rights of people of African descent is the people of African descent communities and their organization. This is one of the key third party that should be involved from the beginning in the discussion. And the uptake and importance of networking is that we forces them to be aware of that and change their behavior. In Belgium, for example, this has the working group visit, the launch of the decade have installed a change of paradigm. Today, we don't have to beg to sit on the table. We're not invited of the table. We are, standard parts of the discussion. When they draft the invitation, there has to be people of African descent and organization. At minimum, in the stakeholder meeting, there's always one that is there with a mission of promoting the entry of the others. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Wade Henderson. I'm the former president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I currently serve as a senior advisor to the Leadership Conference Education Fund, and I'm really honored to be here this morning. I do want to acknowledge the organizers of this program today, the U.S. Human Rights Network and the Leadership Conference Education Fund, for their incredible efforts and their continued collaboration. This is really important. And it is such a pleasure to meet my colleagues from other countries who are addressing the important issues of the decade, and Mireille Fernand, who has been a leader in this effort for many years, a particular privilege to be with her. Let me say I agree with her initial observation that in order to understand where we are today on issues of the decade, one must understand where we have come from over the last 5 years. I take a slightly divergent view, however, about the conclusion of where we stand, because having heard the presentations of 3 panelists this morning from different parts of the world, I am optimistic that our collective efforts are beginning to bear fruit, notwithstanding the difficult challenges that we face or share in common. Now, the experience of the United States in trying to address the issue of the decade is emblematic, certainly of problems experienced by our colleagues in Europe, but also indicative of some of the struggles faced both in Chile and Guyana and other parts of the Caribbean and South America on precisely these questions. And let me say, what looms over all of this is the fear of many countries about the reparative justice movement and whether or not at the end of the day, the decade will help promote an issue of reparations, which is of great concern to these countries for a variety of reasons. But let me start with the U.S., because I do think our history really helps reflect where we've come from in the last 5 years. In August of 2014, the U.S. Human Rights Network and the Leadership Conference led a delegation of civil and human rights activists, NGOs, to the Geneva United Nations Commission review of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and U.S. compliance. It was an extraordinary high point in the human rights movement in the United States. The U.S. Human Rights Network delegation was extraordinarily powerful, but included 2 parents of young people who had been killed in police or actions or related actions. One was the mother of Trayvon Martin, Sabrina Fulton. She was on that delegation. The other was the father of Jordan Davis, the young man who was killed at a gas station in Florida by an angry white man who objected to his music. Jordan's mother is now a member of Congress representing in Georgia. And that struggle is indicative of what came out of that movement, and it's worth noting. So, having said that, let me try to sort of catch up. That delegation was important. The U.S. delegation from the Leadership Conference was equally impressive. We had a coalition of civil rights NGOs who made significant impact in the U.S. on issues related to police violence, related to a host of other civil rights activities, voting rights, voter suppression. It included the Leadership Conference, the Lawyers Committee of Civil Rights, the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, the NAACP, and other organizations. So it was a very powerful delegation. The U.S. delegation was the strongest that had ever been presented. The U.S. ambassador to Geneva was the first Native American to serve as a U.S. ambassador, Keith Harper, and the delegation included people like Loretta Lynch, who was at that time a U.S. attorney out of Brooklyn. It had the current chair of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, Catherine Lehman, and other really prominent individuals of government. It was the strongest delegation we have ever presented. When we went to testify before the ICERD Commission, something unexpected happened. On that afternoon, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, was killed by police. And his picture, where he laid in the street for over 4 hours, was broadcast worldwide. Geneva erupted. The commission was horrified to see an example of the way U.S. gun laws and hostility toward African Americans in particular played itself out in the most dramatic fashion we had seen. It's a very powerful moment. And out of that moment, there was a commitment to advance the goals of the decade, which had not yet been announced, but to promote issues of reparative justice worldwide. Fast forward to the election of 2016. It was a watershed moment in American history and global history. And the election of Donald Trump as 45th president was in part a reaction to the 8 years of President Obama. It was not that Hillary Clinton lost the election. She won by over 3 million popular votes. But she did lose the Electoral College, which obviously is a point of discussion in some other context. But what it meant was that we now had a reactive government, part of a global populist movement, not just here in the United States, but reflected in Europe, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and other governments that reflect that emergence of an alt-right sensibility and the emergence of white supremacy. It made a huge difference. And that's what we see. And Murray is absolutely correct in that regard. But it was a reaction to some of the benefits of having had the Obama administration. All right, so when the decade was established, what we have to understand is don't expect the government, whether it is the United States or European governments or others, to willingly fund NGO efforts in promoting the decade. Primarily because at the end of the day, as I said, there is fear that reparative justice will equate to reparations, which will equate to money payments to individual victims of global racial discrimination in a way that was going to be problematic for these governments. So don't expect people to help that. If you're going to get ahead on this, we're going to have to develop our own agenda to move forward. Now, I do think some very positive things have happened. First of all, in the United States, one reason that we have not attempted to promote this effort over the last 2 or 3 years at the government level, now I'm not talking about at the grassroots or NGO level. Obviously, this meeting is a testament to our continued involvement in that regard. But the last thing we need is to have the current administration seize the discussion of the decade of African-descended people and politicize it in a way that assists in the election of someone who obviously has innate hostility to this effort. I'm not interested in allowing the Trump administration to seize debate on the decade to promote its own involvement in promoting the interests of African Americans. It would be a complete lie. So at this point, what we're trying to do is to help invest at the grassroots and intellectual level and lay a foundation for a post-2020 strategy. Regardless of who wins, we need a strategy to advance the decade in that next 5 years. Number two, there has been an incredible growth of coalition activity, which I think is absolutely essential to advancing the goals that we share in common. Number three, in the U.S., there has been breakthroughs that we have not readily acknowledged. One of them was the June 19th hearing this year on H.R. 40, the bill that would allow for the establishment of a commission in the U.S. to study reparations. That was a huge breakthrough. Congressman John Conyers, the first African-American chair of the House Judiciary Committee, who died earlier this year, had introduced that bill every year for the past 30 years. And yet this is the first time we've had a breakthrough, and it came about because of pressure from the NGO community to seize the moment to have this issue reviewed. Secondly, there is legislation introduced by Representative Barbara Lee to establish a truth and reconciliation and racial healing format to examine issues. We've never had that truth and reconciliation. My time is coming to an end, but I'm going to try to be brief in summarizing this. We have never had that. So it's critically important that we try to support her effort. And Representative Hank Johnson has introduced a bill on the decade to seek federal recognition. That hadn't moved, and I wouldn't expect it to move. And right now, we are in the middle of an election, so that is not, as I said before, the appropriate effort. But here's where I would end. In spite of the fact that there has not been a governmental recognition of the decade, I contend that much has already happened in laying a foundation to advance that goal. I also think that in spite of the growth of a global populist movement, this effort at reparative justice, which runs through America, Europe, South America, and Africa, Asia, it's important to recognize that this movement is connected and that we have to nurture that development in order to advance our broader goal. And that lastly, we need to look ahead at what happens. I use the 2020 election in the US as one marker. In other countries, it would be a different time, to see how we structure a response regardless of who is elected. You know, obviously, we all pray for a more progressive government without veering into election views, whatever that means. But we're not interested in waiting until the decade is over to begin laying a foundation to implement it. We can't afford that. So the next 5 years are critical in terms of advancing our goal. And I think that the work that we have done over the past 5 years lays a foundation for that effort. So thank you very much.
Murray wanted to make a comment before I open it up to questions.
Yes, sorry, I missed two things, two very important things. Last week in Netherlands, there was a people meeting for a conference and manifestation against implementation of Black Pit. You know about Black Pit. And they were attacked. One of their car was burned, and they were beaten by the racist young people, almost more than 10 people, I think. And I would like ask to this conference to make a declaration of solidarity against these peoples who are attacking those who are defending their right and their equality. And by the manifestation of Black Pit with this racist, totally racist, thing.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And it's agreed already, all of you are ready to write a declaration against that and to send?
Yes.
Okay, great. Second thing, also is Haiti. And we have a comrade from Haiti here. I think the situation, and I think all of you will agree, the situation of Haiti is coming from their declaration as a republic and free of enslavement. And they are still paying the price of that. And the price is very heavy for the people, and specifically now where there is a social, political crisis. And I would like also ask to this conference to make a statement saying the foreign interference, US interference, but also French interference has to be stopped at the highest level of the multilateral organization and by the international community to give a chance to the people of Haiti to assume their own destiny and their own future. Do you agree to that?
Yes.
Okay. And I want to read that the last thing because it's very interesting. It's a quote from a person who was elected in 1838 in France. 1838 was 10 years before the abolition, the second abolition in France. And he was speaking about abolition or not abolition. And he was in favor of abolition, but not for moral principle, but for political principle. His name is Charles de Rémusat. At this moment, it was a rapporteur on the Colonial Council, House of Representatives. The task is great. We are asking you to intervene in complex societies to change the way the past has fashioned them. We are inviting you to achieve by law a social reform. it's a task usually accomplished only by revolution. And end quote, and revolution pass through reparation.
Thank you. And now I actually want to open it up to questions. If anyone has a question, if you want, you can go to the microphone, or if you want to say your question, I can repeat it.
No, we can go, come. We can.
And for folks who have a question, there is a microphone here where they can ask their question, or either way.
Go to the mic.
Oh, yeah, it's streaming.
I think it's better
Oh,
if
is
you
that on?
speak.
I'm sorry. You can also come up here if you want to ask.
Just take the screen.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, my question is to NPAD around the European Union resolution. I'm not sure if I agree with your point that there's no formal institutional recognition of IPAD. I think we did have a celebration of NPAD, of the people of African descent in Europe last year. And I just wanted to query what exactly you meant in terms of, do you mean in terms of actual actions being taken by the institutions, or are you saying that, you know, nothing has been done whatsoever? Thank you.
If you want.
Or you want to
Oh,
take
no,
me?
you can just
Yeah,
respond.
we can go. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's about the fundamental right resolution and the recognition of the international decade. When we say there's no formal institutional response, there's a procedure in recognizing a resolution by the EU institution, namely the Council and the Commissions, and the entitled bodies who have to prepare that recognition, so that the mechanism of enforcing it within the member countries is fostered and starts. And this has not been there. That's why, however, there is a fundamental rights of resolution for people of African descent today, because some of the agency like RD, like NR and other constellation of human rights bodies that are there, and the grassroots have lobbied for that, have drafted documentation, and by those MEPs that are working on human rights have championed and have had to have this resolution be made. But as long as we don't have really an institutional recognition to the two mechanisms that are the Commission and the Council of the decade, it's very difficult to have member countries to do, because what do they need? A EU law that says on this topic, member country have to do this and this and this. They have to follow the. Yeah, it's in paper. Okay. Yeah, all member countries have signed, obviously, the resolution, because it was the decade, because it was in an unanimity vote at UN level. But when you come now to the EU body who takes that on to have their member countries implement it and execute there, it's still informal. Informally, yes, but formally not. While if you want to implement, it has to be institutionally recognized.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to the next question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm particularly interested in the engagement of the broad base of the population in forwarding human rights. Sally Engle Murray at Columbia has a whole concept that she calls the vernacularization of human rights that's been particularly promoted in terms of women's rights. But I'm wondering whether or not that concept can be rolled over here. I'm particularly interested in the town meetings that are taking place right now in Chile, I believe. There's a name, they start with a C, Cibaldo, something like that. There are town meetings that are taking place in Chile right now, people trying to figure out, out in the street, town hall meetings, trying to figure out where they go next So I'm just interested in the engagement of the broad base of the population in the promotion of human rights.
Wonderful. Kristen, do you want to take that question about the town meetings that are happening in Chile?
Insistimos con que un pueblo como los afrodescendientes a nivel universal, si no logramos autodefinirnos como pueblos, ¿ya? No va a ser una comunidad sustentable, en el contexto de que el hecho de que cada vez nos sigan nombrando como personas nos va individualizando. Y esa individualización, ¿cierto? El individual, como dicen acá, ha generado el quiebre como pasó en Chile. El caso de Chile es que el sistema neoliberal hizo que vivamos en un mundo mirando hacia adelante. A mí no me importa que lo que le está pasando a mi vecino del lado o a mi vecino del otro lado. O sea, ese sentido es un sentido individual que a nosotros como afrodescendientes no tenemos esa herencia. Nuestra herencia es colectiva. Nuestra herencia es un trabajo colectivo entre una comunidad, ¿cierto? Entre el ayudar el uno al otro. Entonces, hoy día, en este desafío del decenio, sabemos que hay una declaración, ¿cierto? Que está frenada, la Declaración Universal de los Afrodescendientes, y que hoy día tenemos que romper, y creo como desafío del decenio, es exigirle a la CEPAL, por ejemplo, que la CEPAL todavía nos siguen diciendo personas, todavía nos sigue individualizándose. Y creo que el futuro, la sustentabilidad de nuestra comunidad, nuestro pueblo, tiene relación con definirnos como pueblo. Y cuando hablamos de pueblo o colectividades, tenemos que darnos cuenta que muchas veces dicen que en las zonas urbanas se pierde el concepto de pueblo. Y no es así. En el Bronx, cuando yo conocí el Bronx, o sea, el concepto colectivo se maneja, se sigue trabajando. Hay una lucha, resistencia de seguir mantener los elementos ancestrales que nos transmitieron nuestros abuelos y abuelas. Y creo que por ahí, hoy día en esta crisis social, nosotros en Chile, tanto pueblos indígenas como afrodescendientes, tenemos una oportunidad tremenda en cambiar el modelo, el sistema económico que tiene este país. Y creo que es un desafío desde la década del decenio afrodescendiente, como afrodescendientes, de incidir en otros países esta forma de vivir. Y quería sumarme a la del documento de Mirel, que era importante no solamente sumar a Haití, sino a lo que está pasando en Bolivia. El racismo que se está viviendo en Bolivia es algo tremendo que está afectando no solamente a los pueblos indígenas, sino a nuestros hermanos afrobolivianos. El caso de Chile, de alguna forma también, recordar que en Chile es el segundo país hoy día con mayor migración en América Latina. O sea, y la mayor migración de Chile que tiene es afrodescendientes. Primero son los haitianos, los colombianos, los dominicanos, y así están llegando. O sea, hoy día hay una presencia gigante, grande, donde la vulneración hoy día en este sistema social en Chile también está generando una estructura racista, donde el sistema neoliberal hoy día no deja que los migrantes, nuestros hermanos y hermanas afrodescendientes también puedan desarrollarse y tener acceso a la salud y a la educación. Entonces sería interesante también sumar tanto a Bolivia como a Chile y todo lo que está pasando en la región. O sea, está pasando cosas muy fuertes en la región y que debemos mirar con preocupación lo que está pasando en la región. Hoy día fue Ecuador, hoy día Chile, hoy Bolivia, mañana Uruguay está en la misma situación. Hay un sistema político que está quebrando a Uruguay, entonces tenemos que mirar bien qué es lo que puede pasar a futuro. Eso.
Thank you.
May I add one thing to that point?
We actually have
Okay.
a queue here.
All right.
Do you want to ask you a question. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for, elucidating on all of these issues. Just a quick comment slash question to Madame Fanon Mendez. Thank you for your initial assessment of some of the struggles of the International Decade. But for you and for all the panelists, to what extent can we look at the kind of cultural explosion that's been happening in the diaspora community as a sign of progress? Maybe not at the formal nation state level. I'm thinking of things like the nexus that's happened in the exchange between Caribbean, American, and African music, particularly Nigeria, Jamaica, New York, Miami, and Florida. I'm originally from Nigeria and was born here in DC. And I see that there's been all kinds of cross-cultural exchanges taking place in the musical artistic domain, not necessarily in the nation state domain. Then secondly, following from that framework, I'm wondering to what extent has the organization kind of collaborated with people on the continent, because I was at a discussion at the African Union concerning the creation of African museums, both for the African Union in Addis Ababa or possibly in Algiers and other areas on the continent. And my question is, are the Africans getting involved to understand the importance of putting up the diasporic root history in the continent? And that lastly goes to Mr. Henderson. Thank you so much for your comments, but I need to be honest, presently in the US, there is a kind of fissure happening in terms of the differentiation between African descendants of enslaved peoples, American descendants of enslaved peoples, and general the Africa diaspora immigrants that have come in, which I think is a valid distinction to make so long as the larger umbrella is still acknowledged. And so while there's a great success in bringing forward the reparations discussion, to what extent is it being joined to the international framework so that the U.S. doesn't get walled off, but we can have both the recognition of the ADOS movement and its sanctity, at the same time making sure that there's a connectivity to all diaspora peoples? Thank you.
Thank you. It seemed that was quite a few questions, so I don't know if, who would like to take them.
I think Murray was asked a question about cultural exchange and the degree to which the diaspora is related. And I'd like to address the brother's question about the separation in this country and how NGOs are focused. So Murray, would you like to go first?
Up to you, dear.
Please.
Thank you for your comment, but I'm not the best person to answer on cultural exchange. But I understand perfectly your point, and you're right, but I don't know how to manage. I want just to give you an information. Is it quite important? As you know, in 2003, and even it was in the mind of the African Union before, in 2003 there was a resolution saying the diaspora, African diaspora, is the 6th region of Africa. You remember that? But as African Union has a lot of problems to deal with, they have no time to deal with this specific 6th region. And they left, and they leave until now, this box, Pandora box, open. And someone jumped on this Pandora box. And he has decided, he is French, unfortunately he is French. He has decided to create a state of the diaspora. It was decided at the last July in 2008 in Nouakchott, when he was introduced by the former president of Mauritania, Aziz, and it was also recognized by the RDC, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and you can watch on, you can see the link on internet, and is supported by a very interrogative financial group, the GRAAL, G-R-A-A-L-E-O, GRAALEO group, support also by the Al Tamani group from Qatar, and he has decided from a unilateral way to be our prime minister. And I announce you are the subject of this prime minister. And there is a government of this state of diaspora. And also there is some cultural exchange, of course, and one of them is the restitution. But for me, it's like, comment on dit, un enfumage.
It's like,
Comment on dit enfumage? It's like smoke. It's like smoke.
it's not a reality.
It's a
It's
reality.
virtual.
It's a reality, but it's like a way of smoke. We put smoke face of the people like that, they cannot see the reality. And our reality is the structural racism, still. And if we are playing with us as a subject and you decide to be our prime minister, it is a colonial act. It is absolutely a colonial act. We are his subject, as they did when they arrived in Africa and they bring our ancestors to other countries. It's exactly the same thing. And the pity, it is recognized by some African states. It is a pity. That's why also I think we need to react very strongly also against that. And when we were in Dakar, we spoke about that with some African Union representative. One of them was not informed, and the other, no, but they recognize they did not do what they have to do. But the problem is, the reality is, he succeeded to get recognition. And recognition is not this way. We were not working to get a decade as a people, as experts, as a working group. For such people, we work for recognition of people of African descent, and not only recognition that valued them, we are also to recognize and to estimate exactly the subjugation, the instrumentalization of people of African descent made by white people in order to more include them in the white society. It is not what we want. We want equality, equal equality, and not a second zone equality. Until now, it's always third zone equality. And we want recognition in order to see what's valuing them by cultural exchange, for example, but also what is put in place by whites in order to better include them, assimilate us to the white society. We don't want that. We want equality and dignity, equal dignity for everybody.
Thank you. And I also think Melissa wanted to respond to that as well.
Okay, when I was growing up, I remember whenever we spoke of Western culture influence, it was always in the negative. But relating to what you have mentioned, Western African American culture has been transcending throughout the Caribbean region, and is of course at this point seen as a positive light. Like most of the African descendants in this room, I'm looking at my sisters, and many of them are sporting African attire and also their natural hair. And that is something that we have been seeing throughout the Caribbean region over the past couple of years, and it actually started right here in the United States. The same, there's a couple websites right now online that are promoting African American businesses, and even in the region, we're finding that most African Caribbean folks are now finally starting to support businesses that are owned by African Caribbeans. And that, of course, is all, again, coming straight out from what we're seeing happening right here in the United States. And when we were in Senegal, unfortunately, I'm sorry to have to bring this up, but all my sisters were in wigs. Every single young sister in Senegal was in a wig. And so when you ask whether the culture is transcending into Africa, it's not to that extent. So how has it been influencing us in the region is through what we're seeing, an example, the Tyler Perry movies, and what we're seeing in all the other African-centered movies that are coming out of here in the United States. So maybe what we need to do, since language is always an issue, is we need to have some of these same movies that we're seeing, that our sisters in the Caribbean are seeing coming out of America, in French and in Portuguese, where our brothers and sisters on the continent too can see it. Because one thing I've also understand is that many of the Islamic states in Africa, they are literally sitting down watching Arabic movies for 2 hours. So they're not seeing folks who look like them on the main screen. And there's something that we kind of have to start, trying to explore how we can transfer what we are experiencing here in the diaspora to the continent. So hopefully soon we can do something like that within the decade.
And I'd like to respond to the second portion of that very thoughtful question, brother, about the potential separation of African descendants in the growing movement to look at American descendants of slavery, the ADOS movement. Let me say that there has always been a recognition among African Americans, without defining what that means, that immigration is often a reflection of the political status of groups in this country. So that, for example, the treatment of Haitians in the early 1980s was a reflection of the lack of political influence that the African American community had more broadly. And I'm referring now to the distinction between Haitians and Cubans. Cubans were often admitted as, quote, political refugees rather than economic migrants. Haitians were always seen as economic migrants, and our government responded to each of them differently. There was also a racial dynamic that was influencing the way in which our government responded. You see the same thing now in legal immigration from the continent. There are certain quotas that limit the number of migrants that can come in, not rigid racial quotas, but quotas that have the effect of limiting migration from the continent. So it is true that African Americans have embraced the fair treatment of immigrants, whether they are immigrants of African descent or more recently the children of migrants to the United States, the so-called dreamers. As you know, the Supreme Court considered yesterday whether to extend the program for deferred action of childhood arrivals, the so-called DACA program, and African American groups broadly endorsed protecting dreamers. So there is an appreciation that immigration is, and fair treatment, is an inherent value of the African American community. Now, having said that, there is a growing movement to look specifically at the status of African descendants of slavery, who often are brought into a larger group of African Americans, broadly defined. And so the so-called ADOS movement is making an effort to at least acknowledge that treatment. Now, in my view, truth and reconciliation demands it. I mean, we should not be afraid of identifying from whence we come for purposes of examining the factors that led to the current development of our community. The question of how that issue is answered in the issue of reparations hasn't been decided. And I reject the notion of using an African descendant of slavery identity as a way of identifying who is, quote, an African American. I mean, under that circumstance, Kamala Harris would not be considered an African American, when in fact, she is an African American. And what is the important dimension here is the culture in which you were raised and the circumstances that you face as part of that cultural identity. So I think we have to be careful about being too quick to analyze these issues exclusively from the lineage dimension of what constitutes an African descendant of slavery, and look more broadly at the cultural factors which affect how individuals respond to the world. So that's my view.
Okay, so we have one more question. Thank you. Thank you for waiting.
My thanks to all the panelists for a very worthwhile initial plenary. And my question is primarily for Mr. Henderson. I appreciated the concern you raised about the current administration in the U.S. potentially co-opting this decade. God help us. And I was curious, though, about what specifically might give you the concern that they would move in that direction as compared to simply vilifying or denigrating the UN? And then sort of a second part to that, I was also curious whether you might see any political opportunity during this election year. I know you emphasize the importance of a post-2020 agenda, but in the meantime, given the crowded, competitive primary fields, do you think there could be an opportunity to invite or challenge some candidates to highlight the issue of the decade, to talk about the need for a report under the CERD treaty body, a representative to the CERD treaty body, related issues of reparative justice, especially now that reparations has come up in the debates?
Well, those are great questions. Those are great questions. So let me start the process. My other colleagues perhaps would like to join in. First of all, let me say that grassroots African-American communities, but grassroots non-governmental organizations in the U.S. are not so much focused on the decade per se, as much as they are focused on issues that affect their daily lives in important ways. So, for example, criminal justice reform has received a significant boost in reaction to the advocacy of the Black Lives Matter movement, to the death of Michael Brown, to the response of many organizations to injustices that occur in their community around criminal justice. The advocacy and effectiveness of these grassroots organizations has been extraordinary. Look at what happened in Florida with the restoration of the vote for formerly convicted individuals who have served their time. Or look at what happened in Virginia with the efforts to restore the vote of the hundreds of thousands of African-American men primarily, and women, who had been denied their rights. There has been extraordinary progress made, notwithstanding existing problems. So I believe that groups are not focused on the decade, but the work that they are doing helps to promote the importance of decade-related activities and that broader framework. Now, what gives me a concern about the exploitation of the issue is based in part on the effort to exploit the recently passed First Step Act that was signed into law in December by President Trump. Now, let's be honest, the First Step Act was the result of numerous broad negotiation between civil rights and human rights organizations and advocates in the House and Senate to move legislation to restore the rights, first of all, to release some individuals who had been incarcerated for far too long, and to establish other benefits of criminal justice reform, all of which is good. We say, for the most part, very, very good. The fact that President Trump signed it into law is a very positive development, because had he chosen to veto it, it obviously would not have had whatever benefits have occurred between then and now. At the same time, there is an effort to politicize that bill by the president to suggest that his outreach to the African-American community is more substantive than it appears to be. He touts job opportunities and the lowering of the unemployment rate, which began long before he was elected, and the economic factors that have contributed to it began certainly in the last administration. He touts the effort of African Americans in various efforts, education he promotes, for example, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is, those are exaggerations. So all I'm suggesting is, and there is a growing movement, a political movement, to recruit African American supporters, as with any political group, both Democrats and Republicans and independents. But there is manipulation of the facts in ways that I think contribute to problems. Now, with respect to candidates who are currently running for office, for the most part, what you're talking about indirectly are Democrats, because the truth is the third-party candidates that may emerge have not yet, at least it appears to me, from a national perspective, been identified, and I have real concerns about what a third-party candidacy will do in distorting the effects of the election. And at the same time, we have a field of candidates. And now, let me be clear, I'm speaking only for myself, not for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. They have no position on the outcome of elections. I'm speaking now purely personally. But my point is that in a time when there is great uncertainty about the outcome of the elections for many, many reasons, injecting the issue of the declaration into debate, of the decade rather, into debate, which at the same time brings with it the question of reparations. And as you have seen, there has already been some discussion of that in some campaigns. My concern is that that will be used by those of the alt-right movement and others to distort the importance of this election and contribute to problems that we've already seen, whether it's voter suppression, whether it's effort to develop a white supremacist approach to policy issues. There's a real concern about that. And I fear that without a careful recognition of our interests, we may inadvertently stumble into contributing to an outcome that we would not ourselves hope to occur. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You have one more question? Okay, we'll take one last question. Apologies.
Perdón, buenos días. Mi nombre es Altagracia Jan Joseph, de República Dominicana. Para mí, la cuestionante acá, y me parece muy interesante lo que decía el colega, sobre la cultura, de cómo nos han educado como afrodescendientes. Y en el caso de nosotros en República Dominicana, precisamente esa es la gran problemática, que nos han educado de cara a que somos solamente descendientes de españoles, entonces no hay un reconocimiento. Y lo que se está viendo en el último año es una criminalización de todo aquel que osa de contar la historia, de hablar de las contribuciones que hemos hecho como población afro, de cuál ha sido el recorrido. Su vida peligra al punto de hacer pancarta con sus caras, llamar a que se le agreda por estar distorsionando la historia o por querer insertar el pueblo haitiano en la comunidad dominicana cuando hablan de la reivindicación. Incluso hay un video por ahí de una señora que dice que cuando hablan del objetivo del decenio o de los objetivos 2030 es una manera de imponerle al Estado dominicano que cargue con la situación que se vive en Haití. En el caso mío, yo tengo conciencia de mis raíces afro, bueno, por el mero hecho de que mis padres son haitianos, pero en cuanto a lo que es la educación nacional en República Dominicana, lo que se impone es el hecho de que tenemos que agradecerle a España todos los aportes y nada que ver con la afrodescendencia. Entonces, la pregunta concreta sería, ¿qué les ha funcionado a ustedes para trabajar con esa discriminación endógena? Porque ya para combatir los factores externos tenemos las estrategias, pero ya cuando es la misma persona, por ejemplo, yo tengo mi primera cédula de identificación, dice que yo soy india. Entonces ya se pueden imaginar cómo estamos peleando la situación donde una persona de mi color es india o es un morenito lavadito, no se puede asumir como negro. Y una de las cosas, vamos a decir, la cosa más arriesgada que he hecho como afro es presentarme a mi graduación con el cabello tejido con trenzas, porque era como un desafío que la universidad casi no me deja graduar porque tenía el cabello trenzado. Ahora imagínense, ¿cómo peleamos con eso? Donde tú has educado a un negro creyéndose blanco o creyéndose indio, ¿cómo tú haces para que esa persona, a pesar de que va a tener esos ataques de perder sus privilegios, los pocos reconocimientos que pueda tener? Porque al día de hoy el cabello así significa no tener acceso a un empleo. Entonces, ¿qué hacemos para que las personas puedan correr ese riesgo, pero sí pelear por la identidad que le corresponde, con el conocimiento de que en un futuro pueda ser una ventaja, aunque hoy en día básicamente es una desventaja y una amenaza para su estabilidad, tanto física y su propia vida, también económica y de empleo? Muchas gracias.
To whom is your question directed?
Yeah, any of you can answer that, I believe. I think it was more of a general question.
So do you wanna?
Modi is interested in responding, and Maria as well. No. Oh, no, not Maria, I'm sorry, Modi. And Lee.
Thank you. Because this, as Mr. Anderson said, this brings us really to the practicality of the issue. And somebody raised the issue of making human rights really mass educated to people, because in fact fundamentally anyone who might be facing rejection on the basis of his appearance, only that is an infringement to the human rights. Because as constituency, all countries have signed on the Universal Human Rights Declaration, so we are entitled to come appearing in public the way we want, as long as you're not infringing the public laws, right? And this is how for grassroots, coming from the grassroots for us, is to make people comfortable within themselves, gaining empowerment and self-confidence, because all that will have them know what are their fundamental rights, and when objected something that is an infringement, they can come not with an emotional response, but a legal response to that, by saying, you are not respecting my rights when this is not happening. And that's how each one of us in their own embody, because the structural discrimination has been, its most expression is our bodies, the African body, the African descent body, the black body, colored, whatever you want, has been oppressed since then. Its appearance, its color, its smell, everything has been subject to oppression. And in the contemporary day, more than ever, because people start to understand, when people come to be revolutionary, it's because they know something is injustice. There's an injustice, there's something that is not equal, and that's where we should be focusing this next 4 years, is making sure that our networks are strong, but that the mass understand that they have to stand for their right. We all have to stand for our right, and we are genuinely entitled to.
Yeah. And I just want to say that, remind folks that we're going to be talking in the next segment. It's going to be a town hall, and it's going to be more about how we move forward and charting those steps. I'm going to ask if we can keep our comments short.
So I'll be very brief as we conclude. Is that, I'm sorry, Marie, would you like to go ahead?
I want just to make
No, please.
to make a remark on what you said about universality and rights. I think we have to not forget where Universal Declaration is coming from. It's coming from the Independence Declaration, 1777 US, and coming from the French Declaration, 1789 Declaration, where, I'm sorry to say, most of our ancestors were still enslaved, right or not?
Right. Absolutely.
And when we are speaking on equality or human rights, these human rights are coming from there where there is an institutionalization of inequality.
Yep.
And what we have to achieve with this international decade, if we can, I hope, and with the UN Declaration, is to re-equilibrate the equality and to reinstall the equality at the same level for everybody. That means we have to interrogate universal declaration, and it make us aware even the multilateral institutions are responsible in a certain sense of this unequal equality. And it is what we have to restore, and not to speak about human rights. How we can speak about human rights where there is a fundamental inequality in the application of human rights. And if we want to share human rights, we have to find what is coming from the Charter of the Mandang, Mali, 13th century. There is a lot of things said. What is saying in Asia, and we have to recreate indigenous people. What are the relations with the Pachamama for indigenous people? what are the relation with the people with Candomblé, for example, about religion. And we have to redefine all this right through the diverse perspective of all the people around the world, and not only from the white supremacy, because it is still the Universal Declaration coming where the former colonizer, where the former enslavers, and when the white supremacy. That's why we really need to work on the history of law and the philosophy and principle of law. And here we are in the best place to do that, in the Howard University of Law. And I think Mr. Justin Hansford, we have to think and to work on that, on this, what does it mean, universality in the actual world, and how we can restore universality for everybody and not only for people from first zone and for the second zone.
Yeah. And then, if you want
So
to have the last.
lastly, I will be very quick. Your question is a very complex, very challenging question, because it involves elements of colonialism, questions of race, questions of migration, and identity. All those questions, all those issues converge. And let me just add the economic and poverty dimension as well. Okay, that's on the table. So one of the byproducts of colonialism has been the effort to negate the race of African Americans, most especially, and indigenous populations as a general matter, to stigmatize and negate the equality that race, challenges from the perspective of colonialism. That is there. Secondly, there is an effort to homogenize culture in a way that further negates race. This effort of pursuing an ideal of light skin and gradations of, using a melanin test to determine one's eligibility for equality is, deeply challenging. Now, let me say, in spite of the progress that we have made in the United States, and by no means am I suggesting that we have overcome the obstacles of race and we are now in a post-racial society. I'm not suggesting that by any means. But in spite of the progress that we have made, there is still discrimination in the workplace toward people with natural hair. I mean, you find jurisdictions that are passing legislation to say that employers can't discriminate on the basis of how a person wears his or her hair. The fact that we're having that debate here in the United States, one of the most industrialized economies in the Western Hemisphere, tells you that you're going to have that problem in the Dominican Republic vis-a-vis Haitians. It's a struggle. So all I can say to you is this. There is a price to be paid for asserting your individuality and identity and the pride with which you express your Haitian heritage. But there is a recognition that if one does that, your identity is advanced. The broader debate on your entitlement to equality under the law is enhanced once you are recognized as a person worthy of attention under whatever constitution you function under. That has been the way that the civil rights movement, among ways that we have helped to advance the plight of African Americans, most especially. We've challenged the contradictions between what the Constitution and Declaration of Independence has promised on the one hand and the reality of what the current system delivers to people of color on the other. And that's a challenge that one has to incorporate in one's work going forward.
Thank you. I want to ask for another round of applause for the panelists. Thank you so much. And we're going to set up for the next panelist in town hall. Thank you.
So, thank you all, and thanks for the first plenary discussion. I think it really provided some great grounding and context for this discussion that we're going to have now, looking to the past of what we've accomplished and what some of the challenges are, and then how we move forward together in identifying priorities, goals, tactics, and strategies that we can implement to make the next 5 years of the decade meaningful for all of our communities wherever they are across the diaspora. So I have a great panel of experts and activists and advocates who've been doing this work in their respective fields across the world. And so I will introduce them in the order at which they appear on the panel. First, we have Justin Hansford to my immediate left, who's the Executive Director of the Thurgood Marshall Center for Civil Rights and a law professor here at Howard University School of Law. Thank you, Justin, for joining us. Next, we have Luis Ernesto Olav, Coordinator for Afro-Descendant Populations, Red Lad in Colombia. To his left is Ana Luisa, make sure I say that correctly, Ana Luisa Silva, who's a human rights specialist at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. To her left is Marcos Rezende, who is the founder of Collective of Black Entities of Brazil. And then finally, to his left is Kwesi Shade, who's the treasurer of Global African Congress in the UK. Welcome to each of you. So I'm going to pose a broad question to each of the panelists and let them each sort of posit for a few minutes around this question and give us some food for thought. But I really want this conversation to be interactive. So this is more town hall style than the first discussion. So we're going to get each of you to engage in the conversation with us and use the microphone to do so. And if I don't have you engaged, I'm going to offer some more questions to the audience. So the question, the big question and the big idea is, look, we have 5 years left, right? We're at the midpoint of this decade. And there have been some challenges around recognition in countries around the diaspora. Many countries have not recognized the decade. There have been challenges around funding. Many countries have not funded the decade as they are supposed to. Only Russia has contributed to the decade formally. And then there's been challenges around how do we achieve meaningful outcomes for the decade? How do we make the decade meaningful for people of African descent around the country for the long term, for the generations that will come behind us? So I'm going to ask each of you to talk about your vision for the decade over the next 5 years, right? What are those priorities that we should be lifting up? How should we be making the connections that we need to advance those priorities? And then what are some concrete, sort of outcomes that you think we have to focus on and mechanisms for doing so? So Justin, we want to start with you.
All right. So thank you, Skira, for that wonderful introduction. So to get right into it, the decade, to me, does not exist in the United States right now. For 5 years in, we're at the midpoint of the so-called UN decade. But in the United States, we have a very difficult time, I believe, determining what has happened that is a result of the UN decade over the past 5 years. The decade as a concept is a very strong concept as an organizing principle. One of the benefits for having a solid timeline is that it allows us to add a sense of urgency to the work that otherwise would not exist. For example, we know that we have a number of concrete objectives which we want to accomplish in the field of reparations. We want to lower mass incarceration in the United States. If we were to take the approach, which is what I recommend in terms of thinking about the next 5 years, if we were to take the approach of establishing concrete benchmarks, we want to lessen mass incarceration by 30% before the decade ends. We want to engage in a reparations project which results in the passage of H.R. 40 as a matter of course, but also the accumulation of reparations from 20 universities and 20 theological seminaries before the decade is over in the next 5 years. That sense of concreteness and the sense of a timeline which can organize our work can be very helpful. So my first hope would be that coming out of this meeting, as we seek to perhaps relaunch the decade at the mid-decade point, we create concrete goals within the timeline of the end of the decade, which will then add a sense of urgency and a sense of concreteness to the demands that we can make from our stakeholders and partners. Which brings me to the second point I want to make, our stakeholders and partners. Where are they? Here in the United States, where are the funders? Where are the governmental partners? Of course, so we understand that for the last 3 of the 5 years of the decade, we've had a federal government under the Trump administration that instinctively you wouldn't think would be a huge supporter of the UN decade, based on the presence of white nationalism in the federal government's ideology. But what about local governments? What about the city of Washington, D.C.? What about our partners in Congress? We've got the Squad that could perhaps be partners. So as advocates who are engaged in promoting the objectives of the decade, again, once we, number one, create specific objectives to be met before the decade is over, number two, what is our strategy for finding partnerships that will result in some sort of concrete progress being made within that time period? And the final point I want to make is the question of recognition and really awareness. So I teach here at the law school. I asked my students in class this morning, how many of you have heard of the UN decade for people of African descent? Raise your hand. As you can imagine, only one student raised her hand out of about 15 students, but she then later admitted that the only reason she knew about the decade is because I had told her about it a couple of weeks before that. So here in the United States, nobody knows there's a decade for people of African descent. Nobody knows that we're at a midway point in the decade. So in lieu of resources towards the very important objectives of ending mass incarceration or obtaining reparations, can we at least agree on the objective of making sure the decade becomes something that people know exists? And can we get resources to help that happen? Commercials on radio and television, some sort of advertising campaigns. People know more, black people, people of African descent, know more about the release of the Popeyes chicken sandwich than they know about the UN decade for people of African descent. For those who are from other countries who aren't aware about this sandwich, people are literally in the streets fighting over this sandwich. But nobody is in the streets discussing the UN decade for people of African descent. Oh, a person has died over the sandwich. I don't want to spend time talking about this sandwich, but I do want to make the point that people are engaged in aggressive advertising campaigns for frivolous things in the United States, and they are becoming much more well-known than the UN decade. So as advocates here, I hope that over the next 5 years, we begin to demand that resources go towards raising awareness of the decade as a starting point. And after that, I'm hoping that we can set some concrete goals on our major objectives that can be met before the decade is over. I think that's very important. I think one of the main benefits of the decade is the timeline, is the deadline. When we set out to reach goals without a deadline, we have less of a sense of urgency. So I hope we can obtain some of these goals before the decade is over within the next 5 years and think more broadly about who our partners can be. Again, with the way our federal government is set up right now, I don't look to them as our natural, instinctive partners. I'm not closing the door on it necessarily, but I think that we would be remiss to look outside of the federal government in this particular political moment and look for other partnerships. So what are those partnerships? Do we have a list? Do we have a list of partners here in the United States that we're going to approach? What is going to be our ask? Are they going to be foundations? Are they going to be other types of politicians? Will it be companies, corporations? We've had the initiative of the Mapadians, the most influential people of African descent, which is an initiative that has been very successful in getting both private and public engagement around the decade. This is possible. Private funders are interested in supporting. Why have the people fighting for the end of mass incarceration or reparations not been able to tap into that same network? So those are some of my initial comments. I'm looking forward to more conversations, and I am finished with 30 seconds left. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Actually, I have a follow-up to that question, to your answer, because I think you've did a great job of situating the vision for the United States. But how do we place that vision in the context of the broader diaspora, right? Are those same concrete goals and objectives things that we can make direct connections with our partners in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Europe, in Africa? Are those the same types of struggles when you speak about reparations? And we'll have a panel to talk about that later, but reparations or ending mass incarceration or state violence, are those the same experiences that people across the globe of African descent are feeling on an everyday basis and will resonate with them when it comes to identifying these goals and objectives?
I don't want to be reductionist about it. I know that different countries have different unique contexts, which call for a separate analysis for each country. But I do think that there has been a deliberate project of exporting these systems of racial control. So if you think about Brazil, for example, we're going to talk about that in more depth. Colombia, we've got situations where police violence, the use of mass incarceration as a tool of social control, has been, again, exported from the United States to other places as a program. And when I say exported, I'm not talking about just ideologically. We have police who are in the United States who go and do trainings in other parts of the world. We've got, we know that we have Steve Bannon, who has been very influential in forming the United States government's policies. He's traveled to different countries, and he's had statements that he's made about the situation in Bolivia and other places around the world, and of course in the UK, where he has continued to be involved. So although each context calls for a particular analysis, it is true that on the other side, if you want to use that term, there is interaction and exchange of ideas and strategies. We would be remiss not to do the same thing and also exchange strategies and ideas so that we can respond to problems that are being promoted by, in many cases, the same actors or actors that are in discussion, talking about how can we engage in police violence and get away with it? How do we target Black Lives Matter protesters in the United States? People speaking about police violence in Brazil, people speaking about issues revolving reparations in the UK. These opposing groups are in communication, and the decade should be a platform for us to be in communication as well.
Thank you. Luis?
Buenos días. Bueno, voy a empezar con una reflexión. Pues agradezco la invitación y quiero hacer como un paréntesis en algo. Generalmente cuando estamos hablando de estos temas, que para algunos pueden ser académicos o muy políticos, me preocupa que siempre somos los mismos con las mismas. Entonces no vemos las mismas caras. Pero cuando estamos haciendo otros tipos de eventos culturales, eventos de reconocimientos como el que vimos hace un mes, más o menos, en Nueva York, muy masivo, muy concurrido. Entonces, como reflexión y como visión del decenio, pues aquí estamos viendo gran parte de lo que estamos hablando nosotros, es que realmente la información no está llegando a donde tiene que llegar. Nosotros a veces estamos haciendo muchos documentos y quedan muy bien elaborados, pero en la práctica, en el desarrollo, falta voluntad política, falta liderazgo de muchas o articulaciones para hacer que esa voluntad política, porque la voluntad política no nace porque sí, nosotros la tenemos que presionar. Y esa es la lucha que nosotros hemos venido dando. El decenio no nació porque sí, el decenio nació de una presión de toda la diáspora, especialmente en América Latina, después se sumó Europa, viene África, pero ha sido todo con lucha y así nos ha tocado a nosotros. Estábamos nosotros, o hemos venido haciendo, y yo hago siempre esa misma reflexión, y hoy se ha hablado de derechos y se ha hablado de oportunidades. ¿Por qué, si hemos ganado tantas oportunidades, entre comillas, por qué los resultados no son los mismos? ¿Por qué siempre nuestros pueblos están excluidos? ¿Por qué siempre nuestros pueblos están viviendo el racismo estructural? ¿Por qué dentro del mundo que estamos nos ha tocado luchar para que las cosas queden, pero no vemos los resultados reales? Entonces, esa es una de las herramientas que nos da a nosotros el decenio, es un gran reto que nos da a nosotros el decenio, y podemos ver que hay unos ejemplos, por ejemplo, en Colombia. Nosotros en Colombia desde el año 91, que en un cambio de constitución, logramos que se hiciera una ley, que era la ley 70 del 93, en el año 93 se implementa esta ley, y podríamos decir que era una ley casi que de reparaciones, podríamos decirlo, y muy bonita la ley, pero apenas se ha cumplido el 30% y ya vamos 25 años de la ley 70, más de 25, y se ha cumplido un 30%. Participé en la creación de la ley que penaliza el racismo en Colombia. Entonces el racismo es un delito en Colombia. Apenas ha habido un solo caso, desde el 2011, apenas ha habido un solo caso penalizado y todos los días hay racismo en Colombia. Entonces, cosas como esas lo llevan a uno a seguir indagando un poco más, y veo y celebro lo que se hizo en Chile, por ejemplo, que fue incluir el tema de pueblo tribal dentro de la Constitución, como reconocimiento constitucional, pueblo afrotribal, porque les da un parámetro importante para trabajarlo con el convenio 169 de la OIT, que a su vez lo puede transmitir o se puede entender que nos va a generar derechos de reparación. Se puede entender. En Colombia lo hicimos hace rato y no hemos logrado, estamos retrocediendo, pero es la lucha. En México participé este año, el año pasado, en la creación también del reconocimiento constitucional del pueblo afromexicano. Fue un nombramiento nomás, dice todos los derechos, habla de todos los derechos del pueblo indígena, y todos estos derechos también se pueden ejercer para el pueblo afromexicano, y ya. Y eso fue el reconocimiento constitucional. Entonces no nos están dando realmente un lugar, y lo hablan en el marco del decenio cuando crean la ley. También ahora, hablando de censos, los censos, estamos hablando de una época que estamos en América Latina especialmente, bueno, América Latina que fue, y el Caribe, bicentenarios de independencia, ¿sí? O sea, y ahora se está hablando después de 200 años de independencia, donde los países decían que todos éramos iguales y no sé qué, ahora están diciendo, no, hay unos afros, hay unos indígenas, entonces vamos a reconocerlos. ¿Y cuántos son? Entonces vienen los censos. El próximo año por primera vez se incluye en el censo de México la variable afromexicana. Y quedó la pregunta tan confusa que yo creo que no va a ser, eso nos está causando preocupación. Ahora, en Colombia hemos logrado en 3 censos que se incluyera la variable afrocolombiana, y en este último disminuyó la población. El primero fue una encuesta, el segundo fue un censo donde éramos el 10% de la población, y ahora somos el 7% de la población. Entonces, no siempre, cuando vemos todo esto y lo articulamos, y estamos en el marco del decenio, y estamos viendo cómo los gobiernos y cómo los estados están afectando nuestros derechos. Y cada vez nos ponen menos, cada vez nos ponen más trabas. Decía un ministro en Colombia, los negros y los indígenas son el palo en la rueda que detiene el desarrollo. ¿Por qué? Porque defendemos nuestros territorios. Y la defensa de nuestros territorios nos ha llevado a ser amenazados, a ser desplazados. Y toda esta situación, y no pasa solamente en Colombia, o sea, y cuando hablamos de territorios, no solamente es el territorio rural, sino urbano también. Aquí en Washington también vemos nuestra población afroamericana en ciertos barrios, en ciertos edificios, marginados, con problemas. Entonces no nos imaginemos que es que solo el problema de los negros está allá en América Latina, aquí también hay. Pero en conclusión, porque no sé cuánto tiempo tengo, voy a continuar hasta que me saquen el letrero, no había dicho nada. En conclusión, nosotros, el gran reto que tenemos es que realmente el decenio no se quede en estos auditorios, en estos escenarios, ni en las redes sociales. El decenio de los afrodescendientes es un marco de lucha para promover y garantizar el efectivo desarrollo de nuestros derechos. Eso es lo que tiene que ser el decenio. Y tenemos que lucharlo. No solamente postear en el Facebook y en la red social, sino que hay que ir al territorio. Tú tienes aquí un territorio que es una universidad negra, eso es un territorio. Hay que hablarle a la gente, hay que empoderar a nuestra gente, porque eso no puede terminar acá. Eso no puede terminar en el 2024. El decenio es una lucha. Nosotros decimos en Colombia, el pueblo no se rinde, carajo. Y no podemos rendirnos, porque nos quieren ver rendidos, nos quieren ver enredados en documentos, solamente menciones y menciones. Pero tenemos que buscar la igualdad de resultados. Si ellos tienen, nosotros debemos tener más, porque podemos. El pueblo no se rinde, carajo.
Thank you, Luis. Anna, you work at for the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, and the Inter-American Commission is really involved in ensuring that people's rights are effectuated and highlighting the issues that people across the Americas face, especially people of African descent. And so, from your perspective, what can we do? How can the Inter-American Commission be used as a mechanism to elevate the decade, to ensure justice, to ensure development, and some of the themes that both Luis and Justin touched on with respect to recognition and development of justice?
Okay. So good morning, everyone. I work at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, that is an autonomous body of the Organization of American States. It's a multilateral body that covers from Canada to Argentina, most of the countries. There are 34 member states, and we cover different issues from human rights, democracy, security, and development. So I work specifically in this section that is works on human rights. So just so I know what we know about it, how many of you have heard about the Organization of American States? Okay, yeah, it's quite a good number, but it's not very known here in the U.S. So I think it's just to start a conversation, it's good to know if you know about it. Considering that as a good bureaucrat that I'm at the office providing technical assistance to the different member states on how they could implement their international obligations. Mostly it's a really good lab to have all these different countries to work on human rights because they're completely different. They have different capacities to implement any kind of international obligation. So imagine how hard it is for El Salvador to have the same obligation as the US, or to Brazil to have to implement the same thing as Canada is doing. So they have different challenges. They work in different frameworks. So I guess it's interesting because you learn the limits of each one, and you have, I think, states in general, they have to start to prioritize what they can actually accomplish within this international framework. So we had a preparatory call before this event here, and we spoke a little bit about the topics that we would like to speak about and what we would like to approach. And one of the things that we talked about was about the plan of action that the OAS has regarding the Decade on Afro-Descendants. We have a plan of action. It's been on since 2016. And there are a lot of activities and some kind of plans that we are supposed to implement throughout the years. So I went back to this plan to see what we have done and what we still have to do. And I realized that considering all these four different areas that I said, like democracy, human rights, security, and development, I realized that we haven't done much apart from the human rights part. So, for instance, there are like some sections that work specifically on drugs, on women's rights, on the reform of judicial systems, and they have not worked much on that. So it shows that, in general, not within the OAS, and I think in terms of for national states, this is not a priority. This is not like the first agenda that they are going to work on. So we have to think about the strategies on how to actually move these activities and these commitments within other agendas as well. I have talked to Justin a lot about it and about the importance of pushing the Afro-Descendant agenda within other agendas such as the 2030 agenda or the Beijing platform. There are agendas that have, one, they have budget allocation, two, they have countries that are more interested in that. So I think this is one of the first conclusions that I found when I started thinking about it. This is at an international level, right? So after that, I went back to the UN High Commissioner reports on the implementation of the Decade on Afro-Descendants. I don't know if you have read that. It's a really good exercise. You're going to find what countries have reported on what they are doing. There's not much information about many countries. I guess some of them did not report. But it's interesting because some of the actions that they report as like the implementation of the decade, they happened even before the decade started. So they are reporting things that actually they did before, so they consider that it's done. And second, most of like the progress that you find on that, they are related to gender-based approaches in mainstreaming in poverty reduction programs. So basically, states, they create social programs and special measures, and they indirectly actually benefit a black population. So they report that as a progress as well. Basically, they did not aim to actually implement the activities of that decade, but they actually got some results, so they report that. So, and finally, the same challenge as usual, right? Lack of sufficient disaggregated data and lack of special measures. So these are the main challenges that I found going through the High Commissioner report. So considering what I found, looking into that, and what we still can do, considering that we have 5 years to go, I thought that as I work with states in general, governments, I'm a little bit cynical about what goodwill can actually do. So I believe that I know that I'm going to be really criticized about it, but even the idea of a declaration, I don't think this is going to be effective. I think we need legally binding documents. I know how hard it is to actually approve any legally binding documents because the states have to agree with that. But without a legally binding instrument, I don't think any action is going to be taken. So this is the first thing. And this document has to include specific budget allocations. Of course, it has to be according to the capacity of each state. You cannot require Honduras to do the same thing as Canada. It's not going to happen. So it has to be realistic. And also, it should include the obligation to implement national human rights institutions with capacity to deal with issues related to Afro-descendant population. Because in many countries, you already have these national human rights institutions, but they have no idea about how to deal, how to protect and promote the rights of Afro-descendants. And finally, I would like to also speak about indicators. So if you go through like this the High Commissioner report, you find that there's no way to measure any progress. That's why states are reporting things that happened before that maybe they're thinking about doing, and they have no idea of like how to measure the impact of those actions. So if we don't establish clear indicators that this is what you can show, because I believe that at international level, what is really effective is name and shaming. So if you cannot show progress of who actually did well, or if you cannot show that a state did not do anything, this is not going to move forward. So this would be my suggestions, and I think mostly at international level. So this demands, and this is not going to happen just with one institution or one specific rapporteur. I think civil society is really important to do it, because there's no agenda at international level that was actually implemented without pressure from civil society. So I think it starts here, and then it moves up. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So Marcos, we want to turn to you, and coming from Brazil, which has a large, very large, one of the largest populations, if not the largest population of people of African descent around the world. And I know you're going to come up to the podium, but just give us a sense of what is possible, right? There are some nation states that are going to be very critical to us, to being in partnership with, to ensure that some of the outcomes that we outlined today we are able to be achieved, right? If we are talking about international mechanisms, if we're talking about recognitions and legally binding declaration of rights, there are going to be certain countries that are going to be critical to that, to executing those. And so if you can talk a little bit about that from the perspective of Brazil.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Eu gastei um pouco das minhas últimas 48 horas tentando fazer uma apresentação em inglês, mas ontem Salima disse que eu poderia falar em português, pois tinha tradução. Então, obrigado. Na verdade, primeiro eu acho que é importante falar sobre o meu local de fala, né? Como Shakira colocou, eu sou do Nordeste do Brasil, de Salvador, a cidade onde tem a maior quantidade de negros e negras do Brasil, e também muitos espaços de religiões de matriz africanas, né? E eu sou do Candomblé. E por conta disso eu peço licença para os meus ancestrais por estar aqui, e a bênção para as pessoas que são do Candomblé, para que nós possamos fazer uma fala também com o apoio e o suporte dos nossos ancestrais e dos nossos orixás, iquices, voduns e encantados. No ano de 2011, o Brasil assinou um documento da ONU por ser o Ano Internacional dos Afrodescendentes. Depois disso, a ONU declarou a década dos afrodescendentes, dos povos internacionais, dos povos afrodescendentes, de 2015 a 2024. Essa decisão, no Brasil, foi inicialmente aclamada pelo governo Dilma, e ela, no dia 4 de dezembro de 2015, começou a provocar os estados do Brasil para que pudessem assinar essa documentação para implementar a década no Brasil. No entanto, nesse meio tempo, somente o estado da Bahia, que é o meu estado, assinou esse documento, e depois disso, um ano depois do começo dessa ideia de constituir a década no Brasil, nós tivemos um golpe de Estado, que aconteceu em 2016, e com este golpe de Estado, surgiram uma série de leis que mudaram toda a história dos últimos anos no Brasil, desses últimos 3 anos no Brasil. É importante começar por aí, porque o Brasil foi o país que mais recebeu negros escravizados no mundo. E foi o último país das Américas a abolir a escravidão. Com o golpe de 2016, houve uma suspensão de todos os conselhos de monitoramento das políticas raciais. E aconteceu um novo tipo de abordagem sobre as políticas públicas. Nos governos Lula e Dilma, as decisões adotadas eram mais simétricas entre o governo e a sociedade civil. Depois do golpe, essas decisões começaram a vir de cima para baixo. Não existia mais diálogo entre a sociedade civil e o governo. Para além disso, as políticas sociais no Brasil foram congeladas por um período de 20 anos. Ou seja, o Estado decidiu que não mais faria ações sociais para a sociedade brasileira por um período de 20 anos. Essas mudanças teve um impacto muito grande nas populações pobres do Brasil, que são negras e indígenas, em sua maioria. Os governos Lula e Dilma tentaram diminuir as desigualdades históricas que nós tínhamos no Brasil. Se nós olharmos este primeiro gráfico, que fala da riqueza do Brasil, nós vamos ver que o histórico da riqueza no Brasil, nos governos do PT, foi diminuindo. Esse 1% mais rico foi diminuindo de 57% para 36%. Também a população mais pobre foi diminuindo de 77% para 53%. Houve uma tentativa de diminuir esse espaço entre ricos e pobres no Brasil, uma vez que o Brasil é o país mais desigual do continente, se não do mundo. Também é importante pontuar que, com o golpe que houve no Brasil, o Ministério de Promoção da Igualdade Racial, que era o ministério responsável por tratar da década no Brasil, acabou deixando de existir e foi fundido com o Ministério dos Direitos Humanos. E no Brasil, as estruturas dos estados, nós temos 27 estados no Brasil, elas seguem a lógica do governo federal. Então, quando o governo federal extinguiu, acabou o Ministério de Igualdade Racial, também uma série de secretarias que tinham nos estados sobre esse tipo de política deixaram de existir. E hoje, somente no meu estado, que é a Bahia, existe uma Secretaria de Promoção da Igualdade Racial. Em nenhum outro estado do Brasil existe mais essa secretaria, o que demonstra que, em que pese a ONU ter declarado a década, no Brasil nós seguimos no caminho oposto quando ocorreu esse golpe de Estado. Com isso, todos os diálogos das associações governamentais que faziam papel de mediadora e facilitadora das políticas públicas para a população negra e para os povos indígenas, os povos originários, e também para as comunidades estruturadas na tradição, como os quilombos, os povos das religiões de matriz africanas, ou candomblé, deixaram de existir e aumentaram as desigualdades raciais. Então, vamos dar alguns exemplos disso. A intolerância religiosa no Brasil. Nós vamos ver que 59% do que acontece de intolerância religiosa no Brasil acontece com as religiões, com pessoas negras das religiões de matriz africanas. E desses, 53% são mulheres. Também temos problemas que, nos estados, ser mulher negra no Brasil significa correr um risco muito maior de vida. Se nós observarmos esse mapa, no Distrito Federal, houve um aumento. A diferença entre a taxa de homicídios de mulheres negras e mulheres brancas teve um aumento de 116%. Então, nós vamos ver aqui as diferenças dos estados em que é ser mulher negra e mulher branca e os homicídios no Brasil. Também podemos perceber aqui, segundo os dados da ONU Brasil, que a cada 23 minutos um jovem negro é assassinado no Brasil. Em 2017, os dados mostram que cada 100 pessoas assassinadas no Brasil, 71 eram negras, e também em 2015, cerca de 385 mulheres foram assassinadas por dia. Em 2015, nós tivemos 31.264 homicídios de pessoas com idade entre 15 a 29 anos. Mas isso parece que é muito ruim, mas pode ficar pior, e ficou. Então, os dados mostram que no Brasil, esses homicídios só têm crescido. Nos últimos 20 anos, os homicídios contra os jovens negros aumentaram, por armas de fogo, aumentaram 428%. Estou dando esse parecer inicial para que a gente perceba como existe uma diferença nas proporções entre jovens brancos e negros mortos no Brasil. Perceba que no estado como o Ceará, 91% dos jovens que morrem são negros, brancos são 3,8%. Nós estamos falando, Rio de Janeiro, 78% de negros e 21% de brancos. São Paulo, um maior equilíbrio, 51% de negros e 47% de brancos. Mas em todo o Brasil a diferença é 80% de mortes para jovens negros contra 17,5% de jovens brancos. Então, a violência contra a população negra no Brasil é muito grande. Também os dados do encarceramento mostram isso, né? Mas, como nós não temos muito tempo, segundo o que já foi me colocado, eu queria dizer que também tem aumentado os ataques aos templos religiosos, às lideranças quilombolas e os líderes indígenas. Aqui tem dados que eu posso também passar para quem tiver interesse, sobre como os povos indígenas não têm também os seus territórios garantidos no Brasil. E como, depois do golpe de 2016, as lideranças quilombolas têm sido assassinadas de forma mais ampla no Brasil. Podemos ver que existia nos governos Lula e Dilma uma média que não aumentava durante muitos anos. Então, quando acontece o golpe, isso dobrou, e no ano de 2017, isso aumentou para 18 pessoas, que é um aumento de 350% nas comunidades quilombolas. Encarceramento também não é diferente, nós podemos ver os dados. Mas, enfim, o que é importante colocar é que, em que pese todos esses dados, nesses últimos 5 anos, em que a ONU declarou a década dos povos afrodescendentes, a realidade dos povos negros, indígenas, das comunidades quilombolas e dos povos de terreiro no Brasil só tem piorado. Nós acreditamos que, para mudar essa realidade e olhar para o futuro, é fundamental que os governos nacionais se comprometam a implementar e fortalecer políticas de promoção da igualdade racial. O combate ao racismo não deve ser uma ação isolada dos ministérios e secretarias, mas deve ser um empreendimento integrado e articulado entre setores diversos e a sociedade civil. Também acreditamos, Ana, minha colega de uma agência internacional, que as agências internacionais devem estabelecer parcerias com as organizações não governamentais, porque no momento de crise são essas associações que continuam mantendo viva a luta por direitos e garantia de liberdades. E também que essas agências possam oferecer apoio e estrutura administrativa para que os governos estaduais possam ser capazes de desenvolver ações de combate ao racismo e de valorização das culturas não ocidentais. Também é necessário de pensar a intervenção da década afrodescendente sobre 2 contextos. Um contexto de articulação regional na América Latina, por isso a importância da ALDA. Aquele outro contexto que é o que pensa os efeitos do colonialismo nos países do eixo Sul-Sul. A fragilidade institucional das políticas públicas não deve ser confundida com a potência que as organizações não governamentais possuem de articulação de comunidades e transformação de realidades, assim como, em alguns casos, de enforcement sobre os governos. As parcerias com diferentes agentes de transformação social, respeitadas as suas formas de organização e inserção social, devem ser pensadas como estratégia para a implementação de ações previstas no acordo da década, orientadas por um viés afrocentrado e descolonizado, e entendido dentro do contexto da diáspora, observando as desigualdades de gênero, classe e raça. Então, o que nós acreditamos é que nesses 5 anos, nós regredimos muito no que diz respeito ao Brasil, mas que nos próximos 5 anos precisamos fazer ações de pressão sobre as estruturas dos órgãos internacionais para que eles consigam criar novas perspectivas de diálogos entre a sociedade civil e também garantir reparação para o nosso povo que tem passado por toda essa violência no mundo inteiro, de forma a descolonizarmos as mentes brancas que por tanto tempo infectaram essa sociedade, este mundo, com essa ideia de superioridade racial. Obrigado.
Thank you, Marcos. And last but certainly not least, I want to move to you, Kwesi. On the first panel, Modi from INPAD talked a lot about the need for coalitions to work together to advance the goals of the decade, recognition, justice, and development. And talked a lot about what has happened in Europe and different places in Europe with respect to the decade. So looking at it through that lens and from the perspective of the UK specifically, but Europe more broadly, how can we use coalitions to advance this new vision that you have for the decade?
Thank you. I want to start by acknowledging our ancestors for raising us up on their shoulders so that we're here to be able to see what's going on. I want to also acknowledge all of the activists in the room for your commitment to justice and your strength to carry on the struggle. And also, much respect to the organizers of the summit. Now, Global African Congress is an international network of Pan-African organizations, and Global African Congress UK is the UK chapter. So, in terms of the decade, it's a mystery for us in the UK. We're a grassroots organization with no funding. We've been involved in the DDPA process since Durban 2001. We've been all around the world and we've supported other Pan-Africanists in their struggles. But for the masses of Africans in the UK, they're completely oblivious to what's going on with the decade. So I was going to begin by talking about some of the things we've managed to achieve despite those challenges. But instead, I want to focus on what Sister Murray Fanon said, which is that not much has happened in the first 5 years. And we need to focus on other mechanisms and other ways of overcoming white supremacy that aren't dependent on white institutions, white international bodies like the UN or the EU. We have to adopt our own approach. So, how can we square that with this summit and the conversation we're having? My perspective on the decade is that we need to spend the next 5 years focusing or refocusing on the DDPA and CERD. I mean, the decade is only temporary, but CERD and the DDPA, that will continue, that will outlive it, that will outgrow it. So looking forward in the UK perspective, how we've been able to use these mechanisms, one way is in lobbying government. We want to mobilize, educate, and organize the black masses in the UK. We want to bring people together. In the UK, and I'm sure it's the same elsewhere, there are always people, champions in our community that are doing outstanding work with little to no funding. And often they're working in isolation. They don't have the capacity to, organize a summit like this and come together. They just don't have the capacity to do it. So people are working in silos. So one of the things we try and do at GAC UK is bring people together. And CERD and the DDPA is a good opportunity to do that. Now, around the time that Durban happened, about 15 years passed and the UK government didn't submit a single report because there wasn't sufficient pressure on them to do so. That's changed somewhat in the last 5 years. At GAC, we've been able to pressure them to come up with new reports that look at race disparity in general, to look at injustices in the criminal justice system, in the immigration system, in the education system. And this is the way that we want to go forward, not to rely on these UN mechanisms, but to use them to empower grassroots African CSOs to further their work and further their agenda, because nothing will happen unless the government is put under sufficient pressure. So what we need in the next 5 years going forward is the capacity to submit stronger CERD reports on an annual basis. The DDPA calls for action plans around race on an annual basis. It's not being done. No one's going to be able to do that without sufficient funding, without sufficient support from the government, and we need to apply pressure on them to do that. In the CERD concluding observations from the last report, what we have been able to do is we've been able to use observation 14 to produce the Lamley report, which highlighted all of the racial discrepancies in the UK. And CSOs were able to come together and rally around that and get some kind of traction. But it isn't enough. It isn't enough. And the UK has said openly it has no plans for a national plan of action. It doesn't even publicize the CERD process. So for the last 5 years, so for the first 5 years of the decade, what we have been able to do is we've been able to organize a lobby of the UK Parliament, again, with no funding. So we've been able to apply enough pressure on the opposition party in the UK to host our lobby in the Houses of Parliament around African Liberation Day. We then go out into the community, we explain all of this complex stuff to all of the grassroots groups doing the actual work. We try and rope in some African academics to lend their weight to our cause and what we're trying to do. But we create that platform for African activists to come into Parliament, look their MP in the face, and ask them, what are you doing about the decade? What are you doing about the DDPA? And that helps, but we need to increase that. When we hold our lobbies, we want to flood Parliament with all of the African activists who are out there doing the work. We just don't have the capacity to do that at present. And we want to build on it because our lobby does work. I mean, recently we were able to have the director of NPAD come into Parliament and challenge the Shadow Chancellor about the UK's policy on the migration crisis in the Mediterranean. We want to be able to do that constantly. We want to be a thorn in their side. We want to be able to, hold their feet to the fire. Because unless we do that, the decade will roll by and nothing will happen. That's why we're in the position we're in. It's not so much that we're not doing the work. We are, tirelessly. GAC UK is completely unfunded. Probably just said that, but it's important to make that point. We've been at this for 20 years. I've been a member for 7. And we've done so much with so little funding. Now for the next 5 years, it really is a question of, well, what other strategic partners can we bring in to increase our capacity? How can we think outside the box? We can't be trapped in this relationship with these international bodies. We have to be able to come up with alternative plans. And when I say that we want to be able to do more annual reports, shadow reports, alternative reports, it's not to satisfy these international bodies. It's so that we can build an alternative structure, a national network, which we already have, but we want to build on it. We want to put some flesh on the skeleton that we've already got in place. Because if we have that type of solidarity nationally, our reliance on these funders and our reliance on these international bodies becomes less, in my opinion, because for me, all of the power is in the people. And the people organized and mobilized can make change overnight. And we don't have to rely on these international bodies to, fecundate us from the sky. We can just go out and do what we're doing ourselves. And that's what we should be doing for the next 5 years. Refocusing on the DDPA. Everything we need in terms of justification for a radical Pan-African, societal change. Everything we need to justify that type of radical change is already embedded in the DDPA. CERD has highlighted all of this stuff for decades. So the time's come to really take these tools and use them as they should be used, which is as a means for the people to bring about radical societal change and to challenge white supremacy openly. So for the next 5 years, I'm pretty much done with the decade. The focus is focusing on the DDPA, focusing on CERD, and holding our government in the UK to account. And that's it, basically. And the last thing that I'll add to that is that there is a real need for us to build a global reparations coalition, a serious coalition that incorporates everything that we've heard today. And we can't wait on these international bodies to do that. We have to come up with our own solutions. One of them is just networking and talking, so I'm very grateful to be here today, to be making the connections that I am, so that I can go back to GAC UK and report on it, and we can look at ways that we can go forward. And that's our only hope. We have to turn to each other. I have very little faith in these international bodies. I have very little faith in their willingness to actually bring about the change that we need. It's not going to come from them, it's going to come from us. And we have to use these mechanisms for what they are, tools. And unless we use them, they'll just gather dust, and we won't get anywhere.
Thanks, Kwesi. So I want to do a quick summary of what I heard, because there were a lot of themes across all of the speakers that I think we can draw on, and then hear from all of you about what else do we need to add to this long list that I've been taking notes around of goals and objectives that we should outline for the next 5 years. So what I heard was a real commitment and a refocus on the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, on using current international mechanisms like the CERD, of which the United States is up for a review, and they have yet to, they are very delayed in filing their report. And so many organizations are going to be engaging in a shadow report process around CERD, but we are also in the midst of UPR, which is also a mechanism for people to engage around, so I want to note that. Also, I heard a lot of need for support of grassroots organizations and advocates that are working across the diaspora on these issues every day, and are working in regional, national coalitions, but also making connections to international coalitions. So a refocus and trying to bring those folks together more in line with a coordinated action plan and a focus that we can all agree upon. Also heard elevating the decade for everyday people, right? Recognition of the decade for everyday people who don't know about UN human rights mechanisms, but they know about the real life experiences that they go through every day. They know how that impacts their life. And so our ability to take the decade out of this room to people on the streets in Brazil, in the Peregrino, or in Washington, D.C., in Southeast, or in Colombia, right, wherever they are, or in the Caribbean, or in Canada, wherever they are, is really critical and important for us to map out and chart for the next 5 years. And then also, a focus on some real concrete tools that can be used in the long term, whether those are legally binding documents and declaration of rights, whether it's reparations, right, global reparations for everyone, and also connecting the experiences around disparities in mass incarceration, or disparities in police violence, or disparities in access to land rights and water, et cetera. Being able to push state parties to put concrete proposals on paper, national plans of actions to address racial discrimination as it exists in genocide and white supremacy as it exists across the diaspora, is really important and really critical for us for the next 5 years. So those are some of the things that I heard from this great discussion from the panelists. And we have the tools to do it. Each and every one of us in this room, whether we have the funding or not, have resources that we need to tap into, and we need to be creative about those resources and those partnerships, and not rely on the traditional resources and partnerships that we tend to, whether it be the UN bodies or funding or traditional funders, et cetera. There are millions and millions of people of African descent around the globe. Many of them are billionaires. Many of them are millionaires, and we need to reach those folks who are online and who are being social media activists, but they need to be connected to the decade also. So I want to hear from folks in the audience, and I also am monitoring. I'm not just up here doing work. I am working, but I'm monitoring. We have about 30 folks who are watching this online, and so they are making comments and giving questions, and so I'm monitoring that feed, and we'll bring some of their thoughts into the room also. But when I hear from you all in the audience about other themes that we should pick up on as we map out, and this is important because after the afternoon discussion on reparations, we're going to go in some working group sessions and really try to put some of this on paper for the after conference report that Justin and I will be working on with Salima, so that we have something to look back on and something to use as we build this international coalition in the future. So are there any thoughts, ideas, questions from the audience? If not, I'll move to online as you guys ponder. I have one. Great. And of course, if any of the panelists want to offer additional thoughts or questions or want to pose questions, right, that we should be thinking about, please do so. Ma'am, I'm going to stand up. Yeah, I'm going to stand up. No problem.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Bom dia. Buenas tardes. I'm Marion Douglas Ungaro. Some people here I know, and some other people here I know, but they don't really speak to me anymore. And a lot of people here I don't know. So, bem-vindo. Three folks up here, Colombia, Brazil, are from other parts of the Americas. And I have a network which has been around for 10 years plus, Afro-Americas. It has been less active lately, but we have over 3,000 Afro-descendants from all over the Americas in our group that's on Facebook. And Anna, you mentioned earlier the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. I worked at the OAS. I am Black American. That's very important to say. I'm not from someplace else. Both of my parents are Black Americans, U.S. slavery descendants. And in each of our societies, especially for Afro-descendants in the Americas, the local Black populations should be recognized for who they are. If we're not from there, we're not from there. That doesn't mean that they're not Black or we're not Black. But I wanted to point out, I worked for the OAS in 3 missions. I don't know if there were any other Black Americans who worked for the OAS before I did in the 1990s, Peru, Nicaragua, and Haiti. But I'm extremely concerned, and I don't know if Margaret McCauley was here today, or because she doesn't keep in touch either. But I'm extremely concerned, like a lot of other people, about the positions that the OAS has taken on Venezuela and now Bolivia. And we need to have a meeting, a conversation specifically about what's happening in the Americas. I believe we are not represented. Just like in Europe, Afro-descendants are not represented by the European Union. And so I apologize for going on. There's a lot here that I'm not only very interested in, but I have experience, background. I live in Italy as well as here. And I just wanted to bring that out in particular. The OAS has it's beyond a credibility problem. No one is representing the grassroots people of the Americas. The second point, and then I'm finished, is that unlike the folks from Colombia and Brazil, we here in the United States are not talking about indigenous people, Native Americans, and Black people, Black Americans, in the same conversations. And I believe that's not just a strategic problem, but that's historically dishonest. And so I look forward to the day, because I've heard this over and over again from Latin America mainly, folks, Colombia especially, and also Brazil. You can't talk about the Black population without talking about the indigenous people, nor vice versa. We're going to make it together, or none of us is going to make it in the Americas. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think, and Justin, yeah, you want to jump in, I'm sure. I think that's an important point about the connections between indigenous peoples and people of African descent, especially given that, you know, the decade of people of African descent is somewhat modeled off of the indigenous peoples decade, right? Where they have had a permanent forum on indigenous peoples within ECOSOC for very, very, very many years, and has been very useful for indigenous populations across the world. So I think there are lessons that we can learn, but also bridges that we can build, and that's an important, I think, thing for us to note as far as how do we chart the next 5 years, and to look forward to that. Justin, do you want to jump in, and then Anna, if you want to respond to anything that was said?
Yeah,
Go ahead,
sure.
Justin.
Well, thanks for those comments. It was a great reminder that I think, building off of something that was said earlier, not only in Brazil, but I think all throughout the black diaspora, you could make the argument that we are worse off 5 years after the decade was declared. We have at least 3 coups by groups that, if not white supremacists, but at least in opposition to majority black populations. We're talking about Brazil, Bolivia, Venezuela as well. That's taking place. We have what's happened here in the United States in the last 3 years, but if you were to go back even before that, you see a drop in the well-being of people of African descent after the foreclosure crisis, the loss of black wealth. We've seen the rise of police violence even more so. So I think it is the onus is on us to make the argument that within the last 5 years of the decade, I'm sure it wasn't, well, we don't think it's planned this way, but within the last 5 years of the decade, we are much worse off than we were when the decade began. So these efforts, whatever efforts that people are claiming in terms of, the decade in the bureaucracies, they have to really be questioned, and we have to be very clear on what our indicators would be, as Anna said earlier. What are the indicators that we are going to allow to be used to make the argument that groups are not being in support of the decade? Exactly. So that's going 5 years. We can go beyond the past 3 years. And then one point is a question that is less more so on tactics than substance. How are we going to make the decade popular? How are we going to popularize the decade? Again, nobody knows that it's the decade in the United States. Do we have to get celebrities involved? Do we have to engage in an advertising campaign? There are many groups in American society right now that really claim to be in support of whatever, Black Lives Matter and all these things. Artists and all these different people who have large followings claim to be in solidarity. What are we asking of them? And why haven't they used their platforms for something like the decade? That's a question that we should ask.
Great, thanks, Justin. Anna, do you want to, and then Luis.
Thank you for your comment. I think I agree partially, actually I agree with almost everything you said in terms of the underrepresentation of Afro-descendants, mostly African Americans in the organization. The institutions, they just reflect what we see in real life, right? So you find it there. So some of the commitments for, according to the plan of action, is to increase the representation of Afro-descendants. But the OAS is facing the same issues the states face. Like, they haven't yet even counted how many they are. So how can they actually improve that? So it's a long process. I think we are running behind. But I think the first steps to acknowledge that they have a problem. And regarding the decisions, it's a political body. It's states make decisions. Of course, there are the specific section where I work is independent. It's an autonomous body, so they take more independent decisions. But all the others are political commitments. So states decide what to do. So that's it. Thank you.
But that doesn't mean that we can't use our people power to influence what states do, right? I don't think we should leave it there. I think the point is that each of us have agency and networks and social circles that we can mobilize, to Justin's point, to pressure as Kwesi said, pressure state parties to do what we know to be the right thing, but also what they are required to do by the law. And so I think we have to use our resources in that way and identify what those common themes are across our various regions, but also within those regions to push together for that. So Luis?
There is no more question?
Oh, no, yes. Oh, I think he wanted to respond, but do you want to respond and then we'll go to Murray? Okay, yeah, no, for sure. And then Marcos, yes.
Thank you. I want just make a comment.
Well, he wants to respond real quick. Luis, yes, and then Murray will come to you. Sorry. Go ahead.
Bueno, es con respecto a la compañera que habla de los pueblos afro y los pueblos indígenas, y que muchas veces en algunos países de América Latina las luchas van de la mano. Lo que pasa es que nosotros allá compartimos territorio, y el territorio para nosotros es parte de nuestra vida. Y pasa en Brasil, pasa en Colombia, que tenemos podemos decir que unas titulaciones, tanto los indígenas como los afros. Yo soy de Quibdó, Chocó, Colombia. Es un pueblo o es un departamento que el 90% de la población es afro. Y el otro tanto es indígena, podemos decir que un 7%, y un 3% son foráneos, no afros, le llamamos paisas, y no son blancos, son mestizos, pero se creen blancos. Y desafortunadamente son los que manejan la economía en nuestro propio territorio. Entonces nuestras luchas son territoriales, por la defensa del territorio, la defensa de la vida, la defensa de nuestras prácticas culturales. Pero también tenemos luchas de racialización, en donde la población negra o la población afro nos va peor. ¿Por qué? Porque estos países de América Latina son indigenistas. Entonces siempre reconocen a los indígenas, siempre buscan cómo tener el favor hacia la población indígena, o sea, sienten como una culpa ahí. Y se olvidan que estamos los negros o la población afro, y para nosotros el tono de piel nos genera más conflicto, y esas luchas nos toca darlas solas. Ahí en ese momento ya el pueblo indígena ya no se mete. Cuando estamos hablando de territorios, ellos sí, vamos a luchar, vamos a estar con ellos. Pero cuando no, ustedes son los negros, defiéndanse ustedes allá como puedan. Esa es. Entonces yo creo que son agendas que en cierto punto podemos trabajar de la mano, pero hay otras agendas, o hay una agenda propia, nuestra agenda como pueblo negro afrodescendiente, que debemos darla, y la lucha debe seguir. Y necesitamos que esa agenda nos reunamos todos, porque es la misma problemática del pueblo afro, es en todas las Américas y en el Caribe. Entonces así es nuestra, y la lucha es nuestra. Aunque en República Dominicana digan que uno es indio a los negros para confundirlos, pero allá ya saben que son negros. Entonces tenemos que trabajar en eso.
Go ahead, Marcos.
O que Mary colocou é muito importante, porque, na verdade, esses golpes que têm acontecido na América Latina são golpes do capitalismo, do capital liberal, conectado com algumas igrejas neopentecostais de extrema-direita, que estão juntas nesse processo, do mesmo jeito que no processo do colonialismo a Igreja Católica outrora também deu esse suporte. Agora nós sabemos que algumas denominações neopentecostais estão ajudando a garantir esses golpes contra os povos negros e indígenas, que são os pobres desse país. Então, em que pese a fala da companheira Shakira sobre que devemos continuar fazendo coisas, a nossa situação é muito desconfortável. Por quê? Porque a partir do momento em que os capitalistas e aqueles que são do agronegócio, eu não sei como poderia dizer agronegócio aqui, agrobusiness, né? Aqui e no Brasil, percebem que ele tem a segurança do Estado de poder invadir terras indígenas, de poder ocupar os territórios negros, dos quilombos, e matar as pessoas, e não ter nenhum tipo de punição, as nossas vidas correm risco. Nossas vidas correm risco. Então, a luta é do capitalismo, né, que implantou um sistema, que é o racismo, que é um sistema montado por eles para nos aniquilar sistematicamente. E a ONU, no meio da década dos povos afrodescendentes, sinceramente não faz absolutamente nada. Ou muito pouco, não tem compromisso com as nossas vidas. E com todo respeito à companheira, a OEA tem um pouco. A OEA tem um pouco. Então, o que estamos discutindo aqui é que estamos por nossa própria conta. Isso já foi dito há 40 anos atrás. Então, precisamos mudar esta situação através dos nossos esforços. Nós não temos uma saída pensada e de fácil resolução. Mas, com toda certeza, e eu concordo contigo, Salim, nós não podemos esperar dessas estruturas o que elas não vão nos dar. Então, por isso, precisamos sim buscar as nossas estratégias para mudar esse quadro que estamos vivendo, que é um quadro de extrema violência e de completo abandono por parte desses estados, que todas as vezes, e que dizem ser democráticos, mas que todas as vezes que o povo elege governos que são um pouco mais à esquerda, existe um golpe liberal e é tratado com normalidade. E aí justifica-se, mas Evo estava no poder há 11 anos, ele queria ficar mais tempo, mas ninguém questiona Margaret Thatcher, que ficou 11 ou 12, Angela Merkel, que ficou 14. Então, na Europa, tudo é possível, porque lá a democracia é perfeita, dos brancos, de direita ou do centro. Mas na América, todas as vezes, na América Latina, todas as vezes que a centro-esquerda ou a esquerda acessa ao poder, existe um golpe e as estruturas de poder mantêm isso com muita normalidade. Então, por isso, precisamos fazer algo para mudar essa situação.
Thank you, Marcos. Mere?
I would like just to make a comment. I think we have to be realistic. The decade is almost a disaster for people of African descent. We have to be realistic. Nothing was achieved and nothing was changed in their situation. Therefore, I think we have to use the decade when it is possible, but to not expect something specific from this decade and from UN. In the same way, we have to use UN when it is good for us, but not to expect any change from them, as the UN is the international community, and the international community is against people. We have to be realistic. That's the reality. That's their reality. They are in favor of the financial system, but not in favor of people. That's why all states, all around the world, even in the badly developed country, and I don't say underdeveloped, I say badly developed, it's different. The objective, with the support of the IMF and World Bank, is to cut the social programs everywhere around the world. Therefore, we don't have to expect anything from that. Let's use the decade, let's use the UN when it is good for us, but you have to identify our own agenda. And our own agenda, it is what I said when I begin, to maybe to enlarge our force in working with indigenous people. Why I said that? For two things. When the colonizer arrived, first of all, they killed the indigenous, crimes of genocide. Second thing, for plunge the riches, the natural resources and riches of the soil, they installed the transatlantic trade slave with enslavement, crimes against humanity. Therefore, our destiny is linked with indigenous, because we are coming from the same history. And if we work with them, we will reinforce our force. and we will be more visible also. And we have to choose one point. Do we want to focus on UN Declaration for People of African Descent? Do we want to focus on permanent forum? All of are important. But we have to choose one alternative. Otherwise, we will be lost in different activity, and there is people claiming from that, and we will be all time divided. We need now to be united, because the people are suffering, the people are killed, and enough is enough. And I think really we have to work, because it give us a way, a very visible way to focus on reparation. Because through that, if we tackle reparation, this issue of, if you succeed to get visibility on reparation, we will focus on, we will get some input on UN declaration. And we will also get some input on how we can use a permanent forum in order to better orient our work on reparation. And not to lose time to see that and that, because since 5 years, how many meetings were organized? How many? A lot. How many regional conferences were organized? Three of them. What are the results of this meeting and this regional conference? 0 equals 0. And it is exactly the way we are considered by the white supremacy, invisible. And just to give us some attention, organizing regional conference, but we have to be realistic. It's not works. And it not works because we are under invisibilized. That's why we have to take that in charge and take our responsibility to say, okay, because there is a lot of proposal for the future. But the future is it's between our hands. What do we want? What do we want to see achieved? What do we deserve? What the marginalized people deserve? We need to be very clear on that. And I think there is one way to really achieve something. It's through reparation, because already there is a network around reparation, and we have to reinforce it and to see how we can stabilize it. Not only from US, because the goal for reparation is not only what it was pointed out, it's also the issue of land. For the people, for the sovereignty, alimentary, food sovereignty, the issue of land is fundamental, and it's not only fundamental, it is fundamental also in US, because to whom belongs the land until now? Yeah. Just to the financial transnational or some very, very important owner. Yeah. Therefore, really, I ask you, I insist to come out from this conference with a very clear decision to unite all our forces around reparation issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mireille. So yes, we should give a clap. So I recognize we are standing between you and food and lunch. And so I have a few points here online that I have to get to, and I see 2 people here. So you have to be very, very, very concise, like 1 minute concise, or I will gently encourage you to close. So let me go to the folks here, and then I'm going to come to you there. Oh, wait, there's a longer line than I just said. Okay, so just a few comments from folks online. No, don't worry, we'll do it. But just a few comments from folks online. One was that we need to use common terminology that can unite us and not divide us. Another woman, Robin Benton, who's with the U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance Steering Committee, had some great interventions about using the most influential people of African descent as a mechanism for elevating the decade, right? Those are people who have different platforms and are related to different businesses, and they could be tools to elevate the decade. And then some more comments about using CERD and as the mechanism also to achieve some concrete outcomes. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to take all of these questions at the same time, which means you have to be very, very, very concise, or your comment. So, Ndoye, go to you, then Shabanja, and then to you two, and then we'll close. And I'll ask you guys while we're doing that to think of, in one word, right? In one word, what is our priority for the decade? In one word. I may give you two, but one word.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Ngoy Ramadani Ngoma. Soy miembro del equipo del Decenio Internacional para los Afrodescendientes en España. Y bueno, en principio dar las gracias a los organizadores y las organizadoras, a los ponentes y a los traductores y traductoras que nos están facilitando a entender. Quería comentar que, bueno, de todas las reflexiones he escuchado un poquito de pesimismo en cuanto a la cuestión del decenio, de que no estamos avanzando. Y es cierto, ¿no?, que podríamos y se deberían de hacer muchas más cosas, sobre todo que los gobiernos invirtieran más recursos materiales, económicos y humanos. Sin embargo, creo también que en España, desde el país donde he crecido, actualmente en este último periodo, en estos últimos 5 años, la sociedad afroespañola ha tomado mucha conciencia y se ha empoderado, ¿no? Y por lo tanto se han creado espacios de reflexión crítica muy interesantes, como el espacio Afroconciencia, Black Barcelona, el Centro de Estudios Panafricanistas, afrofeministas. Es decir, hasta hace 10 años estos espacios no existían, y hace 5 años ha sido como una explosión en la que se crea contenido audiovisual afrocentrado, se crea música afro, se crea literatura afro, y por lo tanto creo que sí estamos avanzando, a pequeños pasos, pero sí estamos avanzando, y creo que es necesario que nos apoyemos en esa pequeña esperanza, en ese rayo de luz que entra para que sigamos avanzando hacia adelante. Con ello quiero decir que es verdad, también estoy de acuerdo en que no debemos confiar o poner toda nuestra confianza en las instituciones, porque es gracioso a veces pedirle solución a aquella institución que a la vez nos oprime, ¿no? Cuando el esclavo pedía a su amo que le liberase, ¿no? Y esperar que tu amo te responda así, te doy la libertad, y pierda todos esos privilegios, es un poquito difícil de entender, pero creo que es necesario empezar a apostar por las políticas desde abajo y bajar el decenio abajo, porque es verdad que estamos aquí en un espacio de la universidad, un espacio intelectual, pero es necesario que hubiera personas que están en la calle que también estuvieran aquí. Por lo tanto, invito a todas aquellas personas que nos ven desde las redes sociales. Y ahora quiero lanzar mi pregunta para ser breve, y es que en España, a pesar de que estamos haciendo avances, desde el equipo de implementación seguimos también estos avances que hacemos, tenemos un déficit o dos de ellos, que son, por un lado, y me gustaría saber cuáles son vuestras propuestas para que nosotros luego las podamos compartir en España. Por un lado, son la falta de denuncias oficiales. En España tenemos un déficit de denuncias, es decir, puedes abrir Facebook, Twitter, Instagram y ver un montón de gente que se está quejando por cuestiones racistas, pero luego miras en el registro de la policía y no hay denuncias. A lo mejor hay 3 denuncias al año por racismo recogidas en un país de 47 millones de habitantes. ¿Qué está pasando para que la población afro o que sufre discriminación racial no denuncie? El segundo problema que tenemos es la falta de formación. La nueva generación afro no está apostando por formarse. Por ejemplo, hay proyectos muy interesantes que se quedan en una esquina por no saber cómo presentarlos a aquellas instituciones y organismos que nos dan el dinero. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos convencer a los jóvenes africanos y afrodescendientes que deben formarse para conocer las técnicas en este sentido? Muchas gracias.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shaban Jah from the European Network of Women of African Descent. I'm one of the co-founders, and I just wanted to add an input here today. And I see that we do not speak a lot about the political representation. It's really important that we are represented in all the institutions. I can speak for a European level. Recently, we had the first ever anti-racism and inclusion week in the European Parliament. You can see that it's the representation of people of African descent in the European Parliament itself. It's really, really minimal, and we are like an estimated population of 15 million people residing currently in Europe, but we are fiercely underrepresented. It's really important representation. As we speak, we have the EU Regulation 2000 for anti-discrimination and all forms of discrimination. That it's been on hold since 2008 in the European Commission, and it was not passed due to most of the Eastern European countries who are predominantly white supremacists, and we have a big problem in Europe now. There is a big rise in the white supremacist parties. Like, for example, in our own country, in Spain, we have this Vox. They've just gained 52 seats in parliament. That means a lot because most of the European Union countries, in fact, have not recognized the decade yet. As we speak, we only have 2 countries who have actually officially implemented the decade. And we actually need to work on getting the politicians to commit on implementing concrete action around the decade for people of African descent. We work on promoting equalities and equal rights for people of African descent across Europe, but Afrophobia itself in Europe, it's not officially recognized as a specific form of racism against people of African descent. Most of our MEPs in the European Parliament don't know about the decade. We find out this when we were meeting with them. We met with over 62 of them. Every one of them were asking us, what is the decade? We think we need to work on more of awareness, creating and sensitization around the decade. As my colleague in the UK was saying, we are always underfunded. We are not in the conversation. We believe because we don't have an adequate representation, this is part of the problem. So we are just pleading that you include part of this as you're in the agenda forward, the political representation for people of African descent across the globe. And thank you very much for listening to me, and looking forward to this conference. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. 30 seconds.
Thank you.
Please be mindful of the cue card right here.
My name is Okechukwu Iwala. Once again, thank you to everyone here. Just a quick, we're talking about moving forward. So I'm wondering if people here have thought of a comprehensive online database that could digitize Afrocentric and African-based historical records. I'm talking about things like the UNESCO 8-volume series on African history, and equally from the diasporic side, books that talk about the tragedy of the Maafa, the growth of peoples after the Maafa, people like Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Du Bois, etc., to reignite Pan-African perspectives using a digital platform. And salute to the Afro-Latino brothers and sisters that came here. I think a lot more needs to be done in the U.S. to make sure people understand the African energy in the Latino experience. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll
try to respect the 30 seconds. That might be a little bit difficult.
Okay.
However, I will do my utmost. First and foremost, let me thank Ana Almeida for letting me know that this event was even taking place. First comment, I like a lot of the comments that have been said here. I like the comment about an agenda. I like the comment about alliances. However, my history is not good. I haven't heard yet when indigenous Americans in the United States of America wanted to work with African Americans in this country. My history is poor. Point one. Point two, I'm listening and hearing a lot of negativity here. In other words, this is a mantle that was thrust upon us. We have got to, as the UN Decade has said, have recognition, recognizing ourselves as positive agents. Not that this small cohort does not, but by and large, we must be positive in our approach. I've heard about what the UN doesn't do, for whom I have worked. I've heard about what the OAS does not do, for whom I continue to work. I have worked at the European Union for about 15 years. I really would appreciate not hearing what the organizations do not do, not because they do anything. They do not. However, we ourselves have to overcome that lack of activity. We must recognize ourselves as positive agents. Lastly, we talk about coming together as a people in a time when globalization is ever more present. And that is a wonderful concept. I call it a pipe dream. I myself try to do it, living, growing up, going back to Brazil all the time. Final point, in Brazil itself, 57% of the majority, and we know it's more, but let's just say what the statistics tell us. A country whose majority is Afro-descendant, but within which, I can promise you, unity is scarce, okay? So every time I go, I'm hearing and seeing a lot of what we call in the West Indies, crab barreling. Figure that out and then get back to me. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an important point. I mean, yes, please. I think you're right that, what we heard from folks is a sense of concern that the last 5 years of the decade have not yielded what we had hoped initially when it was announced, right? But I think we are all committed to a refocusing of the hope that we felt initially on the next 5 years and making sure the next 5 years yield the outcomes that you talked about. And so thank you for that, and thank you for that reminder.
I'm Sheila Walker. I'm a cultural anthropologist as opposed to a lawyer. And my research issue is the global African diaspora. I notice that we're being very Atlanticocentric, and that's just wrong. We need to include folks on the other side of the Indian Ocean, on the other side of the Red Sea, because they're part of the global African diaspora. As a result of my research, my identity is that I'm from the global African diaspora with a U.S. passport as an accident of a slave ship. I have made some documentaries on this global African diaspora. One of them, let me say something positive about what the UN has done in the context of the decade. I'm concerned with the first theme, recognition. We need to change the discourse, and as long as we don't know ourselves, I don't think we're changing the discourse. The focus on justice or injustice is important, but we need to know who we are in the world. We need to know what we've contributed to the Americas, a transfer of technology from Africa to the Americas, for example. So, in my effort to contribute to our knowledge, my fantasy for the decade is that by the end, we'll know who we are. So, I've made some films about the global African diaspora. I've shown them to U.S. African Americans, not terribly international in perspective. And my favorite response was, I showed two films to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. At the end, one woman jumped up and said, "I have to talk." I said, "Okay." And she said, I'm not the same person I was when I walked into this room 2 hours ago before I saw those films. Those people you showed us, I used to see them as foreigners, as others, as immigrants. Now I see them as us. So she got it, she got a sense of who we are as a global African diaspora. So something positive. And the decade showed one of my documentaries at the UN and sent it around the world to the UN information centers in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Pacific. So I think that's positive. So I wanted to end on something positive as
Thank you.
opposed to what
Thank
we
you.
haven't done.
Please
We
send me the
have.
link. I'll give you my contact information, and we'll make sure everyone here gets it.
Great.
Get a copy of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is.
Final comment.
My name is Akoba Jesse Yeboah. I'm the president of the American Africans United. Our organization is an organization that has been launched in the United States to unite all people of African descent in this country. We believe that that is the only way. We are not waiting for somebody to do something for us. We are coming together to empower ourselves because we have always stretched this government do this thing for us. We are expecting people to do something for us that we have to do it ourselves. So because of that, this Saturday is a day that we have set up to become the year 400, beyond 400 years. There was a rally we are organizing at MLK Memorial Park this Saturday to call to action that we of African descent, we have to come together and empower ourselves, not waiting for United Nations, not waiting for any government. We have to come together like all races in this country. They don't care who sits at White House. Asians don't care. Only we of African descent always think about who will be the president because we don't have the means. We don't work as one people. We always undermine ourselves. So we are calling to action this Saturday at the Memorial Park that every African descent in this country come. We are setting up agenda by ourselves, not from United Nations, not from ourselves. We have to come together and do things for ourselves. So always expecting somebody to do something for us.
Thank you.
When can we get up? So this Saturday, 12 o'clock at the mall, there was a rally of unity beyond 400 years of slavery. And all African descent, whether you are immigrant, you are Afro-Caribbean, you are Afro-American, we are all of one people. We are all from Africa. Africa was born in us, not necessarily you are born in Africa. So we are all invited.
Thank you. So I'm going to model this one word for you all so you know what to do. So my one word for the decade, and I'm going to draw on what Marae said, reparations.
Justice. Reparación.
Reparations.
Reparación.
That's okay.
Affirmative actions.
Equality.
Self-determination.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate it. Thanks to those of you who were online, and we will continue to monitor online. So we have a break right now. We're going to go to lunch, and lunch is upstairs in the Polly Murray room. So please do go help yourselves, take whatever breaks you are. We're going to come back here at 2:15.